the Byzantine state emerged from profound crisis. By the 3rd century, the Mediterranean world stood on the brink of collapse. For nearly 50 years, starting in 235, a period historians later termed the Crisis of the 3rd century, brought a perfect storm of civil wars, foreign invasions, economic depression, and plague. In just 5 decades, more than 20 men claimed the throne, most ruling for mere months before meeting violent ends. Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Persian armies threatened from the east. Rebel generals proclaimed themselves rulers in Gaul and Palmyra. The once unified Mediterranean civilization seemed destined to fracture into regional kingdoms, ending the Pax Romana that had prevailed for centuries. From this existential danger emerged Diocletian, a soldier of humble origins. Born to a family of freed slaves in Dalmatia, he rose through military ranks during these turbulent times. When Emperor Numerian was found dead in the late summer of 284, the army proclaimed Diocletian as successor. Unlike his many short-lived predecessors, Diocletian not only survived, but fundamentally reshaped governance across the Mediterranean. Recognizing that no single man could effectively rule such vast territories, Diocletian instituted the Tetrarchy, rule by 4. He divided administration into eastern and western haravs, each governed by an Augustus, with a junior, Caesar, as designated successor. Diocletian took the east for himself, while appointing his comrade Maximian to rule the west. This division acknowledged geographic and cultural reality. The Greek-speaking, urbanized, and commercially vibrant East had always differed profoundly from the Latin-speaking, more rural West. Diocletian's reforms extended beyond politics. He reorganized provinces, separated civil from military authority, regularized taxation, and attempted to combat inflation through price controls. Though many measures ultimately failed in their immediate goals, they created foundations for continued Mediterranean unity. Significantly, Diocletian elevated the imperial position from merely first citizen to a semi-divine figure, adopting elaborate court ceremonial from Persian traditions. When he voluntarily abdicated in the early 4th century, an almost unprecedented act, the tetrarchic system quickly unraveled in renewed civil wars. From this chaos emerged Constantine, son of one of Diocletian's former tetrarchs. After defeating his rivals at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in the autumn of 312, supposedly under the sign of the Christian cross, Constantine reunited the Mediterranean under his sole rule. Though maintaining many of Diocletian's administrative structures, Constantine made 2 decisions that altered the course of history: embracing Christianity and founding a new capital in the East. Christianity had spread throughout the Mediterranean for nearly 3 centuries. Despite periodic persecutions, Constantine's Edict of Milan, issued the following year, granted legal tolerance to the faith. While Constantine himself delayed baptism until his deathbed, he actively promoted Christianity throughout his reign. A dozen years later, he summoned the First Council of Nicaea to address theological disputes, personally intervening in church affairs and establishing a precedent for imperial involvement in doctrine that would become characteristic of Byzantine governance. Even more consequential was Constantine's decision to build a new capital on the site of ancient Byzantium. Located at the strategic crossroads of Europe and Asia, where the Bosporus Strait connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, this site offered both military security and commercial advantages. In the spring of 330, Constantinople was officially dedicated as the new capital, a Christian city adorned with monuments, forums, and churches, but deliberately echoing the layout and institutions of Old Rome. This new Rome would stand as the seat of power for over 11 centuries. 7 years later, Constantine died, and his successors experienced periods of division and reunification. Theodosius I briefly restored unity, but upon his death in the final years of the 4th century, administration was permanently divided between his sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. Though theoretically still one state, the two halves would follow dramatically different trajectories. The 5th century witnessed the Western territories' slow dismemberment by Germanic kingdoms. Britain was abandoned in its early decades. Spain fell to the Visigoths, Gaul to the Franks, and Africa to the Vandals. Italy itself came under the control of Odoacer, a Germanic commander who deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476, a date traditionally marking the fall of the western half of the ancient Mediterranean state. Yet in the East, the legacy of antiquity not only survived, but thrived. Protected by Constantinople's formidable walls and blessed with greater wealth, the Eastern state, which we now call Byzantine, would endure for nearly a millennium after the West's fall. Through periods of astonishing glory and devastating defeat, the Byzantines preserved and transformed classical heritage, creating a distinctive civilization that blended ancient law, Greek culture, and Christian faith. The Byzantine world that emerged would stand as the direct continuation of classical civilization, maintaining its laws, governmental structures, and traditions, while evolving into something distinctly different. As Constantinople's influence grew, the Greek character of society strengthened. Christianity became not merely the official religion, but the central organizing principle of society. And while Western Europe fragmented into competing kingdoms, Byzantium maintained the ideal of universal authority, an idea that would persist until Turkish cannons finally breached Constantinople's walls in the spring of 1453, bringing the millennial legacy of antiquity to a definitive end after more than 2,000 years. The imperial capital rose as more than just another royal residence. Constantine envisioned an urban center that would embody the future of Mediterranean civilization, faithful to the new religion, Greek-speaking, and oriented toward the wealthy eastern provinces. The location proved strategically brilliant. Positioned on a triangular peninsula where Europe meets Asia, protected by water on 3 sides, and controlling the vital strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. This geography made the city nearly impregnable to siege, while simultaneously placing it at the crossroads of lucrative trade routes. The physical construction of the new metropolis deliberately mirrored the ancient capital. 7 hills formed the topographical backbone of the urban landscape, just as in the old city on the Tiber. The emperor erected a new senate house, forums, and administrative buildings. He embellished his creation with monuments and statues, many brought from other parts of the Mediterranean. Most were pagan in origin, ancient artistic works of classical civilization, creating a curious juxtaposition with the overtly religious character of this new foundation. Great palaces rose along the waterfront, and a massive hippodrome, capable of holding 100,000 spectators, served as the center of public life. Yet the eastern capital differed from its predecessor in one crucial aspect. From its foundation, it was explicitly dedicated to the new faith. While traditional temples still dominated the skyline of the old capital, this newly established city featured prominent houses of worship. The first cathedral of Hagia Sophia, meaning Holy Wisdom, was constructed during this period, though it would later be rebuilt on a grander scale. The city contained no pagan sanctuaries, marking a definitive break with tradition. This spiritual orientation would define the city's character throughout its existence. The establishment of this eastern metropolis coincided with the transformation of belief from a persecuted sect to the dominant faith of the Mediterranean world. Constantine had already convened the Council of Nicaea in the mid-320s, bringing together bishops from across his domains to address theological disputes. The council established the Nicene Creed, declaring that Jesus Christ was of one substance with the Father, a direct rebuke to the teachings of Arius, who claimed Christ was subordinate to God the Father. Though the Arian controversy would continue for decades, Nicaea represented the first attempt at establishing orthodox doctrine through imperial intervention. During this formative period, the Eastern faith developed distinct regional centers. The Patriarch of the new capital gradually gained prominence, second only to the bishop of the Western capital. Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch in Syria served as additional influential patriarchates. Jerusalem, while spiritually significant, initially held less administrative importance. These Eastern patriarchates would form the backbone of what would later become Eastern Orthodoxy, developing theological and liturgical practices distinct from those of Western believers. Constantine's embrace of the new religion did not go unchallenged. His nephew Julian, who ruled briefly in the early 360s, attempted to reverse this spiritual transformation and restore traditional worship. Known to history as the apostate, Julian promoted philosophical Neoplatonism and sought to revitalize ancient temples and sacrifices. His premature death, while campaigning against Persia, cut short this pagan revival, and his successors quickly resumed patronage of the new faith. Julian's failed experiment demonstrated that the religious landscape had changed too deeply to be dislodged. External threats soon tested the defenses of the eastern capital. In 378, near the city of Adrianople, Gothic warriors inflicted a catastrophic defeat on imperial forces. Emperor Valens perished in the battle, along with 2/3 of his army. This disaster forced his successor, Theodosius I, to adopt a new approach to the Germanic peoples pressing at the borders. Rather than opposing them militarily, he settled large numbers as federated allies within the frontiers. These Gothic warriors received land and autonomy in exchange for military service, a solution that temporarily relieved pressure, but planted seeds for future instability. The late 4th century brought growing cultural divergence between East and West. While Latin remained the official administrative language of the Bosporus capital, Greek increasingly dominated everyday life. The eastern provinces had always been culturally Hellenic, dating back to Alexander the Great's conquests 6 centuries earlier. Now, the imperial city itself was becoming Hellenized. This linguistic shift reflected deeper cultural differences. The East remained urbanized, literate, and commercially vigorous, while the West became increasingly militarized and rural. Theodosius I, ruling from 379 to 395, represented the last ruler to effectively govern both eastern and western regions as a unified state. A fervent believer, he banned pagan sacrifices, closed temples, and suppressed the Olympic Games. Under his reign, the new faith became not merely permitted, but mandatory. The traditional gods, worshipped for over a millennium, faced their final eclipse. Upon Theodosius's death, the administration divided permanently between his sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. Though theoretically still one state, the two halves would follow dramatically different trajectories. The 5th century witnessed starkly divergent fortunes between East and West. Western provinces crumbled under waves of Germanic migration and invasion. Britain was abandoned to local rule. Spain fell to Visigothic control. North Africa, the vital agricultural heartland that supplied grain to the Italian peninsula, came under Vandal domination. The Western court retreated from Milan to the more defensible Ravenna, but even this could not halt the decline. In 410, Alaric's Goths sacked the ancient city itself, the first such catastrophe in 8 centuries. The psychological impact was enormous, prompting St. Augustine to compose his monumental work, The City of God, in response. By contrast, the Eastern territories maintained integrity and prosperity throughout this turbulent period. The massive land walls of the Bosporus metropolis, constructed during the reign of Theodosius II in the early 5th century, proved impenetrable to barbarian forces lacking sophisticated siege equipment. The Theodosian walls consisted of a triple line of fortifications extending across the peninsula, with a moat, outer wall, and massive inner wall, featuring 96 projecting towers. These defenses would preserve the eastern capital from land-based assault for nearly 1,000 years. Economic factors further distinguished East from West. While Western tax revenues collapsed as territories were lost, the Eastern government maintained control of wealthy provinces: Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. These regions provided abundant grain, taxes, and manpower. Eastern trade networks remained intact, connecting the Mediterranean to the Silk Road and Indian Ocean. The gold solidus, introduced by Constantine and maintained at consistent weight and purity, provided monetary stability unavailable in the inflation-plagued West. The Eastern court developed increasingly elaborate ceremonial during this period. Influenced by Persian traditions, the monarch became a remote, semi-divine figure, rarely seen in public and surrounded by strict protocol. Court officials developed specialized roles in a complex hierarchy. Access to the imperial presence became highly restricted, with visitors required to prostrate themselves before the enthroned ruler. This ceremonial, described in detailed handbooks, emphasized the superhuman nature of imperial authority, a dramatic departure from the relatively informal princeps of earlier times. As the 5th century progressed, Western authority continued to disintegrate. A succession of weak rulers governed briefly, often controlled by Germanic military commanders. The final Western emperor, ironically named Romulus Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus, was deposed in 476 by the Germanic general Odoacer. Rather than claiming the imperial title himself, Odoacer ruled Italy as a king, nominally acknowledging the Eastern monarch's sovereignty. This event traditionally marks the fall of the western half of the ancient Mediterranean state, though contemporaries saw it more as a political adjustment than a civilizational collapse. The Eastern court, now the sole inheritor of imperial legitimacy, regarded developments in the West with a mixture of concern and calculation. Emperor Zeno, ruling from the Bosporus capital, formally recognized Odoacer's control of Italy, granting a veneer of legitimacy to the new arrangement. Yet the Eastern authorities continued to consider these lands as temporarily lost territory rather than permanently ceded. This perspective would motivate later attempts at reconquest, most notably during the 6th century. Even as the West fragmented, intellectual and cultural life flourished in the Eastern heartlands. The great university, founded by Theodosius II in 425, institutionalized higher education with 31 chairs for grammar, rhetoric, law, philosophy, and medicine. The law code, commissioned by the same emperor, the Codex Theodosianus, represented the first systematic compilation of imperial legislation since the 2nd century, bringing order to a confused legal landscape. Meanwhile, the faith generated new forms of cultural expression through hymnography, sacred architecture, and theological writing. By the late 5th century, a distinctive Eastern identity had begun to emerge, blending traditional political institutions, Greek cultural expression, and Orthodox religious practice. The ruler now held a dual role: secular leader in the classical tradition, but also Christ's viceroy on earth, responsible for the spiritual welfare of his subjects. This concept of imperial authority, fundamentally different from the evolving political structures of Western Europe, would define governance in the East for centuries to come. The early 6th century brought a new dynasty to power in the Eastern realm. Justin I, an illiterate soldier from the Balkan provinces, rose from peasant origins to the imperial throne in 518. More significant than Justin himself was his nephew and heir, who would become one of the most consequential rulers in Eastern history. Born in a Balkan village around 482, the future sovereign received education in the great city under his uncle's patronage. He married Theodora, a former actress and courtesan, a scandalous choice that revealed his willingness to defy convention. When he succeeded his uncle in the summer of 527, few could have predicted the ambitious scope of his coming reign. Theodora proved far more than a controversial consort. Intelligent, politically astute, and fiercely determined, she emerged as her husband's most trusted advisor, and at crucial moments, the backbone of his regime. Contemporary historian Procopius, though hostile to the empress, acknowledged her exceptional influence. Theodora's background gave her insights into the lives of common citizens and women that were unavailable to most rulers. Her advocacy led to expanded legal rights for women, including improved inheritance laws and protections for actresses and prostitutes seeking to leave their profession. The imperial couple faced their greatest crisis just 5 years into their reign. In January 532, the Queen of Cities erupted in the Nika riots, named for the crowd's rallying cry of Nika, meaning victory. What began as typical sports violence between rival chariot racing factions, the Blues and Greens, transformed into a massive uprising against the government. Underlying causes included doctrinal tensions, high taxation, and resentment of corrupt officials. For 5 days, rioters controlled the streets. They proclaimed a new emperor and besieged the royal household within the Great Palace. Much of the city center burned, including the original cathedral. With escape ships prepared, the monarch considered fleeing. At this critical juncture, Theodora delivered her famous declaration: "Purple makes a fine burial shroud," referring to the imperial color. Her courage stiffened her husband's resolve. Imperial troops under the general Belisarius cornered thousands of rioters in the hippodrome and massacred them. The revolt was crushed, leaving the ruler with a traumatized metropolis, but also an opportunity to rebuild. The reconstruction after the Nika riots produced the city's most magnificent monuments. The sovereign commissioned a new Hagia Sophia to replace the burned sanctuary. Completed in just 5 years, this architectural marvel featured an unprecedented dome, spanning 108 feet in diameter and soaring 180 feet above the floor, appearing, as the emperor proclaimed, to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain. Innovative engineering allowed abundant light to enter the vast interior space, creating what many considered the most beautiful building in the Mediterranean world. Beyond this great cathedral, the monarch undertook numerous building projects: houses of worship, hospitals, aqueducts, bridges, and defensive works throughout his territories. In the great city alone, he built or reconstructed over 25 sacred buildings: the Church of Saints, Sergius and Bacchus, and the Church of the Holy Apostles exemplified the emerging Eastern architectural style, with their central domes and Greek cross-floor plans, Perhaps the most enduring achievement came in legal reform. Early in his reign, the emperor appointed a commission under the Juris Tribonian to codify all existing laws. The resulting Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law, consisted of 4 parts: the Code, which compiled imperial legislation; the Digest, which gathered juristic writings; the Institutes, a legal textbook; and the Novels, which contained new laws. This monumental work preserved and systematized a millennium of legal development, while adapting it to contemporary society. This comprehensive codification would later form the foundation of most European legal systems and remains influential in modern civil law. Administrative reforms accompanied legal codification. John the Cappadocian, the brilliant but ruthless finance minister, restructured tax collection to increase efficiency and reduce corruption. Though John's methods provoked resentment, they generated revenue needed for the monarch's ambitious programs. Meanwhile, the government reorganized provincial administration, strengthened central authority, and reformed currency. These measures aimed to support the grandest ambition, reconquering the lost western provinces. By the 530s, the Eastern state had assembled a formidable military machine. The great general Belisarius, who had crushed the Nika rioters, led an expedition against the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in 533. With a relatively small force, Belisarius achieved stunning success, defeating the Vandals at the Battle of Tricamarum and capturing their capital Carthage. Within a year, the entire region returned to Eastern control after nearly a century of Germanic rule. Emboldened by this victory, the imperial court dispatched Belisarius to reconquer Italy from the Ostrogoths in 535. The initial campaign proceeded rapidly, with Naples and the ancient city on the Tiber falling to Eastern forces. However, Gothic resistance stiffened under their king Totila. The war devolved into a grueling struggle lasting nearly 2 decades. Cities changed hands repeatedly. The old capital itself was captured and recaptured 5 times. The fighting devastated the Italian peninsula, destroying infrastructure and depopulating major urban centers. Even the ancient aqueducts were cut during the conflict, never to be fully restored. By 554, Eastern forces had finally secured Italy, but at tremendous cost. A separate campaign reclaimed part of southern Spain from the Visigoths. For a brief moment, the ambitious ruler had partially restored the Mediterranean to its ancient unity. Maps of his enlarged domain resembled the old borders before the 5th century collapse, with imperial authority once again spanning from Spain to the Euphrates. Yet these conquests proved difficult to maintain. In Italy, a new Germanic threat, the Lombards, invaded just 3 years after the great sovereign's death, seizing much of the northern peninsula. In Spain, eastern holdings remained limited to a coastal strip. North Africa faced persistent Berber resistance. The Western reconquest had stretched military resources dangerously thin, particularly when a more formidable adversary threatened the eastern frontier. The Sassanid Persian state, sophisticated and centralized, posed a far greater challenge than the Germanic kingdoms of the West. Under their king, Khosrow I, the Persians launched repeated invasions into eastern territory. In 540, at the height of the Italian campaign, Persian forces sacked Antioch, one of the great eastern cities. The Bosporus court was forced to pay substantial tribute to secure peace on this front, diverting resources from Western campaigns. The Persian menace foreshadowed a pattern that would persist for centuries. Eastern rulers caught between threats from both directions, unable to address one without exposing themselves to the other. As if military challenges were insufficient, Nature itself seemed to conspire against imperial ambitions. Beginning in 541, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague swept through the Mediterranean world. Now known as the Justinianic plague, the disease killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, up to a quarter of the world's population. The capital was especially hard hit, with thousands dying daily at the outbreak's peak. The emperor himself contracted the disease but survived. The plague's demographic impact severely undermined recovery efforts. Tax revenues plummeted as the population declined. Agricultural areas faced labor shortages. Military recruitment became increasingly difficult. The plague returned in periodic outbreaks for the next 2 centuries, preventing complete demographic recovery and limiting the resources available to the state. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the determined monarch maintained his ambitious vision until the end. In his final years, he continued to build, legislate, and defend his concept of imperial authority. His ecclesiastical policy sought to unite his diverse subjects under one orthodox understanding, though his efforts to reconcile various theological factions achieved limited success. He aggressively suppressed paganism's remaining strongholds, closing the academy in Athens that had operated since Plato's time nearly 9 centuries earlier. When the emperor died in 565, after 38 years of rule, he left a transformed Mediterranean world. The borders had been temporarily expanded, the legal system comprehensively reformed, and the great cathedral stood as an architectural wonder. Yet the state was exhausted financially, demographically weakened by plague, and militarily overextended. The Western reconquest, his most ambitious project, would prove ephemeral. Within a century, most of these territories would be lost again to new invaders. Nevertheless, this remarkable reign represented the last great flourishing of ancient Mediterranean civilization before profound transformation. The legal code preserved classical jurisprudence for future generations. The building programs established models for Eastern and later Islamic architecture. The concept of imperial authority, combining absolute political power with religious leadership, defined governance in the East for centuries to come. Even as the immediate territorial achievements crumbled, this legacy as the last classical emperor endured in Eastern historical consciousness. The Golden Age this ambitious sovereign aspired to recreate proved fleeting, but the Eastern civilization that emerged from his reign would demonstrate remarkable resilience in the face of challenges that, in the coming century, would transform the Mediterranean world beyond recognition. The death of the great legislator in 565 marked the end of an era. His nephew and successor, Justin II, inherited a domain geographically expanded, but fundamentally weakened. The treasury stood empty, depopulated provinces struggled under excessive taxation, and fighting forces were stretched dangerously thin across 3 continents. Almost immediately, the carefully reconstructed Mediterranean unity began to unravel. In Italy, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Just 3 years after the great ruler's death, Lombard invaders poured through the Alpine passes. Unlike earlier Germanic peoples who had sought accommodation with Constantinople, these newcomers seized territory outright. By the century's end, Byzantine holdings in the peninsula had shrunk to isolated coastal enclaves around Ravenna, Naples, and the southern extremities. The ambitious reconquest had largely come undone. Meanwhile, the Balkan provinces faced devastation from Slavic and Avar incursions. These tribal peoples crossed the Danube frontier in massive numbers, settling permanently in lands that had been under Mediterranean authority since classical times. The once prosperous provinces of Illyricum, Macedonia, and Thrace were extensively depopulated. Even the outlying districts of Constantinople faced raiding parties. By the early 7th century, Slavic settlements had reached the Peloponnese in southern Greece, fundamentally altering the ethnic composition of the Balkan Peninsula. On the eastern frontier, the perpetual rivalry with Persia intensified. The Sassanid monarch, Khosrau II, launched a series of devastating offensives early in the 7th century. City after city fell to Persian forces. Antioch, Damascus, and Jerusalem all succumbed. In 614, Persians captured Jerusalem and seized the True Cross, the most sacred relic, reportedly discovered by Constantine's mother Helena 3 centuries earlier. Egypt, the vital breadbasket that fed Constantinople, fell in 618. For the first time in 3 centuries, the wealthy eastern provinces had been lost to a foreign power. Within this catastrophic context emerged one of history's most remarkable leaders. Heraclius, son of the Exarch of Africa, sailed to Constantinople with a fleet in 610, overthrowing the inept Phocas. Assuming leadership of a society seemingly on the verge of extinction, Heraclius implemented sweeping reforms. He reorganized the remaining territories into military districts known as themes, where soldiers received land grants in exchange for hereditary military service. This system, fully developed over subsequent decades, would form the backbone of defense for centuries to come. Heraclius then undertook a desperate counteroffensive against Persia. Unable to confront the massive Persian armies directly, he led his forces deep into the enemy heartland in a daring maneuver. The courageous leader marched through the Caucasus Mountains, wintering in the snowy highlands, before descending into northern Mesopotamia. In December 627, his exhausted troops achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Nineveh, forcing the Persian Shah to sue for peace. By 630, all lost territories had been recovered, and the True Cross triumphantly returned to Jerusalem. This victory proved astonishingly short-lived. Even as Heraclius celebrated his triumph over Persia, a new power had emerged from the Arabian desert, united by the Prophet Muhammad and his message of monotheistic devotion. Muslim armies exploded into the Levant beginning in 634. The timing could hardly have been worse. The Byzantine state and Persia had exhausted each other in their recent conflict, leaving both vulnerable to this unexpected threat. The Muslim advance proved unstoppable. Byzantine forces suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. Damascus fell shortly thereafter, followed by Jerusalem in 638. Egypt was conquered by 642. The consequences were profound. Territories that had been integral to Byzantine society since its inception, regions that had been centers of classical civilization for a millennium, were permanently lost. North Africa would hold out somewhat longer, but by the early 8th century, it too had fallen to Muslim control. These catastrophic territorial losses transformed Byzantine society's fundamental character. The wealthy, urbanized, and culturally diverse provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt were gone. What remained was a much-reduced domain centered on Asia Minor, the Aegean, and southern portions of the Balkans. Even more significantly, the demographic composition shifted dramatically. While the earlier Mediterranean state had encompassed numerous ethnicities and spiritual traditions, the reduced realm became more homogeneously Greek in culture and Orthodox in devotion. This transformation was reflected in language. During Heraclius's reign, Greek finally replaced Latin as the official administrative language, more than 3 centuries after Constantinople's founding. The occupants of the Bosphorus throne now faced an existential challenge from Muslim power. Between 674 and 678, Islamic forces mounted a massive combined land and sea assault against Constantinople itself. The siege was finally repelled through use of an innovative weapon known as Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary substance that could burn even on water. Projected through bronze tubes mounted on ships, this fearsome weapon gave the Byzantine fleet a crucial advantage. Greek fire's exact composition remains unknown, as its formula was kept a closely guarded state secret, but it likely contained petroleum, quicklime, and sulfur. Further demonstrating their remarkable resilience, the defenders repelled another massive Muslim siege of Constantinople in 717 to 718. Under the leadership of Leo III, the populace withstood a combined land and sea blockade through an exceptionally harsh winter. Thousands of besiegers died of starvation and exposure, while their fleet was devastated by Greek fire. This decisive victory marked the high water mark of early Muslim expansion. Henceforth, the frontier between the two powers would stabilize along the Taurus Mountains in southeastern Asia Minor, where it would remain with minor fluctuations for centuries. The Muslim conquests had profound consequences beyond merely territorial losses. The once dominant Mediterranean became a contested space, with Muslim fleets challenging Byzantine naval supremacy. Sicily, Crete, and Cyprus faced raids and partial occupation. Trade routes were disrupted, further diminishing economic power. Most significant of all, the Levant and North Africa, birthplaces of Christian tradition, came under Islamic rule. Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Antioch, founding patriarchates of the Orthodox Church, were lost. The doctrinal center of gravity shifted decisively to Constantinople, strengthening the theological influence of its patriarchs. As Byzantine society fought for survival, its internal doctrinal life underwent a traumatic controversy. In 726, Leo III issued an edict against sacred images, initiating the period known as Iconoclasm, or image breaking. Influenced perhaps by Islamic prohibitions against representation or by concerns about idolatry among the populace, Leo ordered the removal of icons from churches. This decree met fierce resistance, particularly from monastic communities. The theological dispute centered on a fundamental question: could the divine nature of Christ be depicted in physical form, or did such representations demean his spiritual essence? For over a century, with brief interruptions, the Byzantine world was torn apart by this controversy. Icons were destroyed, then restored, then banned again. Those who venerated images faced persecution, imprisonment, and even martyrdom. The issue transcended mere artistic preference, striking at core theological concerns about incarnation and the relationship between spiritual and material realms. The dispute also carried political dimensions, becoming interwoven with power struggles between court officials, patriarchs, the monastic community, and the aristocracy. Iconoclasm finally ended in 843, when Theodora, serving as regent for her young son Michael III, restored icon veneration in a ceremony still celebrated in Orthodox churches as the triumph of orthodoxy. The resolution affirmed that icons could depict the human nature of Christ and the saints, though not their divine essence, and that the honor given to images passed to the prototype they represented. This theological settlement reaffirmed the distinctive spiritual identity of Byzantine culture. At a time when its political and cultural distinctiveness, from both the Islamic East and Latin West, was becoming increasingly pronounced. Indeed, the relationship with Rome and the Western territories grew increasingly strained during this period. The absence of Byzantine authority in Italy created a power vacuum that the papacy increasingly filled. When the Lombards threatened Rome, in the mid-8th century, the popes turned not to Constantinople, but to the Frankish monarch Pepin for protection. This alliance culminated on Christmas Day, 800, when Pope Leo III crowned Pepin's son, Charlemagne, as Emperor of the Romans, a direct challenge to Byzantine claims of being the sole legitimate continuation of ancient authority. From the Byzantine perspective, this coronation represented usurpation. Despite territorial losses to Muslims, the succession in Constantinople had maintained unbroken continuity from Constantine and earlier rulers. They viewed themselves as the only legitimate heirs to Rome, regardless of territorial extent. Charlemagne's coronation created a competing tradition in the West, formalized in coming centuries as the Holy Roman Empire. The gulf between East and West widened further as their respective spiritual traditions developed in different directions, with Latin and Greek churches diverging in liturgy, practice, and increasingly, theology. Despite these challenges, the reduced Byzantine heartland demonstrated remarkable resilience throughout the 8th and 9th centuries, defending a more compact territory with reorganized military forces. Society stabilized and gradually began to recover. The theme system proved effective both militarily and administratively. Under this arrangement, provincial governors held both civil and military authority, a departure from the strict separation of powers established by Diocletian 5 centuries earlier. This pragmatic adjustment recognized the defensive priorities of a society fighting for survival. By the late 9th century, as internal stability returned and Muslim power temporarily waned, Byzantine forces began a period of territorial recovery. Under the Macedonian dynasty, founded by Basil the Firm in 867, the purple-born soldiers gradually reconquered territories in southern Italy, the Balkans, and eastern Asia Minor. Cultural and intellectual life revived as well, in what scholars term the Macedonian Renaissance. Ancient Greek texts were copied and studied with renewed vigor. The university in Constantinople was revitalized. Art and architecture flourished, developing distinctive styles that would influence Orthodox visual tradition for centuries to come. The controversy over sacred images represented the most profound internal crisis Byzantine society faced during this period. Its roots reached deep into theological questions that had animated Orthodox discourse for centuries. How could the divine and human natures coexist in Christ? How might the faithful appropriately venerate holy persons without falling into idolatry? What was the proper relationship between spiritual truth and material representation? Leo III, who had heroically defended Constantinople against Muslim besiegers in 717 to 718, initiated the conflict in 726 with an edict against sacred images. The exact motivation behind his decree remains disputed. Some contemporary chroniclers suggested he was influenced by Islamic prohibitions on representation, which he observed during his early career on the eastern frontier. Others pointed to a massive volcanic eruption in the Aegean in 726, which Leo allegedly interpreted as divine punishment for idolatry. Modern scholars emphasize Leo's desire to strengthen central authority over the Church and to address concerns about superstitious practices among the population. Whatever his motivation, Leo's actions provoked immediate resistance. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Germanus, opposed the policy and was forced to resign. Pope Gregory II in Rome condemned the edict. Most significantly, the monastic communities throughout Byzantine lands became centers of opposition. The controversy quickly engulfed society at all levels, from theological debates among the educated elite to street riots and the defacement of venerated images. Under Leo's son, Constantine V, iconoclasm intensified. Ruling from 741 to 775, this energetic and intellectually sophisticated monarch provided theological justification for image destruction. He convened a church council in 754 that declared image veneration contrary to Orthodox teaching. Constantine argued that any material representation of Christ either separated his human and divine natures or pretended to circumscribe his divinity, both unacceptable theological errors. Icons of saints and the Virgin were similarly condemned as inappropriate veneration of mere humans. The implementation of these policies was often brutal. Sacred images were whitewashed, defaced, or destroyed. Monks, the primary defenders of icons, faced persecution. Some were publicly humiliated, paraded through the streets of Constantinople, with monks and nuns forced to march holding hands, mocking their vows of celibacy. Others were imprisoned, exiled, or even executed. Monasteries were confiscated, their properties redistributed to supporters, or converted to military barracks. Despite this repression, iconophile resistance persisted, particularly in the monastic strongholds of Bithynia and the remote mountains of southern Asia Minor. Theologians like John of Damascus, living safely under Muslim rule beyond Byzantine reach, developed sophisticated defenses of image veneration. John argued that the Incarnation, Christ becoming human, legitimized material representations. Just as the divine Word had taken physical form in Jesus, sacred truth could be conveyed through material images. Furthermore, John distinguished between worship due only to God and veneration, appropriately offered to saints and their representations. The first phase of iconoclasm ended in 787, during the regency of Irene, who ruled on behalf of her young son, Constantine VI. Irene convened the Seventh Ecumenical Council at Nicaea, which restored image veneration and anathematized the iconoclasts. This council established the theological principles that would ultimately resolve the controversy, distinguishing between veneration of images and worship of God alone. However, the issue remained divisive. In 815, Leo V reinstated iconoclasm, beginning a second period of image destruction that would last until 843. During this phase, persecution was generally less severe, though theological debate remained intense. The ultimate resolution came under Theodora, who officially restored image veneration, while her son Michael III was a minor. The triumph of Orthodoxy celebration on the first Sunday of Lent in 843 marked the definitive end of the controversy. The iconoclast dispute left lasting marks on Byzantine devotional practice. When image veneration was restored, clear guidelines emerged for the creation of sacred art. Icons became more standardized, following established patterns rather than artistic innovation. The theological understanding of images as windows to the divine, rather than objects of worship themselves, was firmly established. Paradoxically, having survived this existential challenge, sacred art emerged with greater theological clarity and a more defined place in Orthodox practice. Beyond the immediate controversy, iconoclasm reflected and accelerated the growing divergence between Byzantine and Western Christian traditions. Rome had consistently opposed iconoclasm, seeing it as overreach into doctrinal matters. The controversy highlighted different understandings of church-state relations, with the Byzantine model granting significant authority in spiritual affairs to the throne, a concept later termed Caesaropapism by Western critics. This period also witnessed other significant spiritual developments. The missionary activity of brothers Cyril and Methodius, dispatched from Constantinople to the Slavic lands in 863, laid the foundation for the conversion of numerous Slavic peoples to Orthodox practice. They created the Glagolitic alphabet to render Slavic languages in written form and translated essential liturgical texts, establishing a distinctly Slavic form of Orthodox tradition that would eventually spread to Bulgaria, Serbia, and ultimately Russia. Meanwhile, relations with Rome continued to deteriorate. Disputes arose over theology, jurisdiction, and practice. The addition of the word filioque, and from the Son, to the Western version of the Nicene Creed, describing the Holy Spirit as proceeding from both Father and Son, rather than from the Father alone, became a significant point of contention. Though the theological nuance might seem minor to modern ears, it represented a unilateral alteration to a foundational creed and implied different understandings of relationships within the Trinity. The Photian Schism of the 860s foreshadowed greater ruptures to come. Patriarch Photios of Constantinople and Pope Nicholas I of Rome excommunicated each other amid disputes over jurisdiction in Bulgaria and theological differences. Though this specific breach was eventually healed, it established a pattern of conflict between Byzantine and Western Church leaders that would culminate in the formal schism of 1054. As the 9th century drew to a close, the Byzantine world had developed distinctive spiritual characteristics that would endure for centuries. A rich tradition of icon veneration, tight integration of church and state authority, sophisticated theological discourse, magnificent liturgical expression, and growing estrangement from Western practice. These elements would form the basis of what would later be recognized as Eastern Orthodoxy, distinct from both Roman Catholicism and the various Protestant traditions that would emerge in later centuries. The existential threats of the 7th and 8th centuries necessitated fundamental restructuring of how Byzantine society governed and defended its territories. The most significant innovation was the theme system, which transformed both military organization and civil administration. This reform evolved gradually over more than a century, beginning with emergency measures under Heraclius and reaching full development by the early 9th century. In essence, the theme system divided the remaining territories into military administrative districts, each commanded by a strategos, general, who exercised both civil and military authority. This pragmatic arrangement reversed the careful separation of military and civilian power, instituted by Diocletian and Constantine nearly 4 centuries earlier. In an age of constant external threat, defense took priority over institutional checks and balances. Initially, each theme corresponded to the territory where a particular military unit was stationed and drew its recruits and supplies. Soldiers received land grants in exchange for hereditary military service, creating a class of farmer soldiers. This arrangement addressed the critical financial and manpower shortages while establishing motivated defenders with direct stakes in the territories they protected. The earliest themes were established in Asia Minor: Armeniacon, Anatolicon, Opsikion, and Thracian, corresponding to the remnants of field armies withdrawn from lost provinces. As the system evolved, themes were subdivided as populations recovered and administrative requirements grew more complex. By the late 9th century, approximately 25 themes existed, varying in size and importance. The strategos of each theme commanded its military forces and oversaw civil administration, tax collection, and justice. Below the strategos, a civilian administration mirrored the military hierarchy, with officials responsible for finances, judicial matters, and public works. This reorganization proved remarkably effective. The theme armies though individually smaller than the field forces of earlier centuries, provided a layered defense in depth against Muslim incursions. Local knowledge and personal stake in the land motivated these provincial forces, while their dispersal throughout the realm prevented any single military commander from easily seizing power. A constant concern, given the history of army-backed usurpations. Complementing the provincial theme forces, the throne maintained central field armies, known as tagmarta. Established by Constantine V in the mid-8th century, these elite regiments were stationed in and around Constantinople. The tagmarta served multiple purposes. They provided a professional striking force that could reinforce threatened themes, conducted offensive operations beyond the borders, and, importantly, counterbalanced the power of provincial armies. Their direct loyalty to the crown served as insurance against provincial revolts. The theme system also reshaped Byzantine's social structure. The stratiotica katamarta, soldiers' estates, created a class of free peasant soldiers responsible for their own equipment and training. Legislation carefully regulated these properties, prohibiting their sale or division, to ensure the continued availability of military service. This policy maintained a free agricultural class at a time when Western Europe increasingly moved toward feudalism and serfdom. Byzantine society thus preserved aspects of the ancient Mediterranean social order, even as the West underwent fundamental transformation. Naval defense underwent similar reorganization. Maritime themes were established in coastal regions and islands, with sailors receiving land grants comparable to their land-based counterparts. The Byzantine fleet, devastated during the early Muslim conquests, was systematically rebuilt. By the 9th century, naval forces had regained dominance in the Aegean and much of the eastern Mediterranean. They were organized into the main fleet, headquartered in Constantinople, and thematic squadrons stationed throughout the maritime provinces. The theme system reached its effective height during the early Macedonian dynasty, which came to power in 867. Basil the Fun, founder of this line, rose from humble origins in a Macedonian peasant family to become one of the most effective leaders of the medieval period. His 60-year dynasty oversaw significant territorial expansion and internal consolidation, building upon the institutional foundations laid during the previous 2 centuries of crisis and adaptation. Under Basil and his successors, particularly Leo VI, known as the Wise, the legal system underwent comprehensive review and updating. The Basilica, promulgated under Leo, condensed and systematized Justinian's legal corpus, translating it from Latin to Greek and adapting it to contemporary needs. This massive compilation in 60 books served as the foundation of Byzantine law until the fall of Constantinople 6 centuries later. Supplementary legal manuals provided practical guidance for judges and administrators throughout the provinces. Leo VI also produced influential works on military science and governance. His Tactica synthesized classical strategic principles with contemporary military realities, offering practical advice to commanders facing Muslim, Bulgar, and other adversaries. Such works represented the pragmatic adaptation of classical learning to the defense requirements of medieval society, a hallmark of Byzantine intellectual culture. Agricultural policy during this period aimed to protect the free peasantry, seen as essential to both tax revenue and military recruitment. The farmer's law, which likely originated in the 7th or 8th century and continued to evolve, regulated rural life and land tenure. Legislation repeatedly attempted to curb the expansion of large estates at the expense of small landholders. These laws prohibited the powerful from purchasing peasant lands during famines. required large landowners to pay the tax obligations of poor neighbors they had absorbed, and established peasants' rights to water sources and common pasturage. Despite these protective measures, the growth of large estates accelerated during the 10th century, as military success created greater security and prosperity. Wealthy aristocratic families consolidated land holdings, often absorbing adjacent peasant properties through purchase, foreclosure, or occasionally coercion. The Dynatoi, the powerful, increasingly dominated provincial life, challenging throne authority and undermining the social basis of the theme system. Urban life, which had declined precipitously during the 7th and 8th centuries, began to recover under Macedonian rule. Constantinople remained exceptional, a metropolis of several 100,000 inhabitants, when most Western cities had shrunk to mere thousands. Provincial centers like Thessalonica, Trebizond, and Nicaea maintained urban traditions and gradually expanded as security improved and commerce revived. Cities remained centers of administrative, liturgical, and economic activity, preserving aspects of classical urban culture that had largely disappeared in the West. Economic revival accompanied institutional recovery. The Byzantine gold coin, the numisma, maintained consistent weight and purity for centuries, providing monetary stability throughout the Mediterranean basin. Indeed, this currency circulated widely beyond Byzantine borders, serving as the preferred medium of exchange from the Baltic to Arabia. Strict regulation of markets, crafts, and commerce, detailed in the 10th century Book of the Prefect, maintained quality standards and price controls, particularly in Constantinople. Trade networks gradually re-expanded after the disruptions of the Muslim conquests. Byzantine lands occupied a crucial position between the Islamic world and Western Europe, facilitating exchange of goods and ideas. Luxury items, silks, spices, ivory, and precious metals flowed through these commercial crossroads. The silk industry, a closely guarded monopoly since Justinian's time, produced magnificent textiles in state workshops. These valuable fabrics served both as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers and as profitable trade goods. Naval revival enabled greater commercial reach. By the 10th century, Byzantine merchants were active throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. Commercial treaties with Russ's traders from the late 9th century established profitable connections to the Baltic via the Dnieper and Volga river routes. Phoenician merchants received trading privileges in Constantinople, laying the foundation for that city-state's commercial empire. These mercantile relationships carried mixed long-term consequences. Economic integration with Italian maritime republics would eventually create problematic political and military dependencies. The cumulative effect of these administrative, military, and economic reforms was a remarkable Byzantine recovery. By the mid-10th century, the state had weathered its existential crisis and emerged institutionally strengthened, albeit geographically reduced. The theme system provided effective provincial governance and defense. The central bureaucracy in Constantinople maintained sophisticated fiscal, diplomatic, and administrative functions. The military had evolved from the ancient model into a more flexible and sustainable force. Most importantly, society had developed distinctive cultural and devotional forms that would define Orthodox civilization for a millennium to come. This adaptive resilience stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of institutional survival and reinvention. Faced with catastrophic territorial losses, demographic collapse, and theological controversy, Byzantine civilization had not merely endured, but had preserved essential continuity with ancient Mediterranean traditions while evolving into something new. As the 10th century progressed, this reformed society would translate institutional recovery into territorial expansion, reaching its medieval zenith under the leader history would remember as Basil, the Bulgar Slayer. As the first millennium drew to a close, the Eastern Mediterranean realm reached its medieval zenith under the formidable guidance of a singular figure. Born to the purple, a son of Romanos II and grandson of Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, this heir's path to genuine authority proved remarkably difficult. When his father died unexpectedly in 963, the young prince was only 5 years old. His mother promptly married the successful general Nikephoros Phocas, who ascended the throne as regent. After Nikephoros fell to assassination in 969, another commander, John Tzimiskes, seized control. Only upon his death in 976 did the legitimate heir, now an adult, gain his hereditary position. Yet even then, he faced immediate challenges to his rule. The young monarch's initial years witnessed a dangerous civil war when the general Bardas Skleros revolted in Asia Minor. After this threat was suppressed, another powerful commander, Bardas Phocas, nephew of the former ruler, Nikephoros, raised the banner of rebellion. The situation grew so dire that the throne sought assistance from Prince Vladimir of Kyiv, promising a royal princess in marriage in exchange for warriors. This alliance not only helped secure victory over the rebels, but led to the conversion of the Kievan Russes to Orthodox Christianity, a development with profound historical consequences. These early struggles forged the character of this remarkable sovereign. Unlike many heirs raised in the sheltered environment of palatial luxury, he developed into an austere, disciplined, and singularly focused administrator. Contemporary accounts describe him as preferring field headquarters to court splendor, simple meals to lavish feasts, and straightforward speech to diplomatic subtlety. He remained unmarried throughout his life, dedicating himself entirely to governance and warfare. This ascetic temperament, combined with tactical brilliance and strategic patience, made him exceptionally effective. The greatest challenge facing the Eastern realm came from the Bulgarian Tsardom, under its ambitious Lord Samuel. Taking advantage of internal strife, Samuel had built a powerful Slavic dominion, stretching from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, effectively challenging Constantinople's traditional supremacy in the Balkans. Beginning around 986, the Eastern forces mounted a methodical campaign against this formidable adversary. Rather than seeking dramatic battlefield victories, they adopted a strategy of gradual attrition, systematically recapturing fortresses, securing mountain passes, and cutting supply lines. This painstaking approach culminated in 1014 at the Battle of Kleidion. After Bulgarian forces were defeated in a narrow mountain pass, the victor ordered an action that would earn him the sobriquet Bulgar Slayer. According to contemporary chroniclers, he had 14,000 captured Bulgarian warriors blinded, leaving one man in every 100 with a single eye to guide his comrades home. When Tsar Samuel beheld his mutilated army, he reportedly collapsed from shock and died 2 days later. This calculated act of terrifying cruelty broke Bulgarian resistance. By 1018, the entire Bulgarian realm had been annexed to the eastern state. This victory represented more than mere expansion. It eliminated a significant rival, secured the Balkan Peninsula, and brought the wealthy agricultural regions of modern Bulgaria and Macedonia under Constantinople's fiscal control. The reintegration of these lands was managed with characteristic thoroughness. Local nobles were incorporated into the Greek aristocracy, granted titles and court positions in exchange for loyalty. The Bulgarian Church maintained its autonomy, but acknowledged the authority of the Constantinopolitan Patriarch. administrative structures were established that blended Greek governance with respect for local customs. With his northern frontier secured, the monarch turned attention eastward. Campaigns in Armenia and Georgia extended the reach of the Constantinopolitan court into the Caucasus region. These efforts were less about direct conquest and more about establishing buffer zones and tributary relationships with local princes. Strategic marriages linked frontier aristocracies to Greek interests. Commercial treaties secured trade routes to Central Asia. By the early 11th century, the influence of the Eastern court stretched from Venice to the Caucasus, from Crimea to Syria. Behind battlefield triumphs lay administrative acumen. The sovereign maintained firm control over the bureaucratic apparatus, personally reviewing financial accounts and provincial reports. He proved particularly vigilant against the encroachment of the great landowning families, who threatened both peasant holdings and central authority. Legislation aimed to protect small farmers, who provided both tax revenue and fighting men. When aristocratic landowners attempted to absorb peasant properties through foreclosure or coercion, the court intervened decisively, earning resentment from powerful families, but securing the economic foundation of the state. The financial management during this period witnessed particular excellence. The gold numisma maintained its weight and purity, providing monetary stability throughout Mediterranean commerce. Tax collection reached peak efficiency, with minimal corruption or aristocratic tax evasion. When this remarkable lord died in 1025 after a 50-year reign, he reportedly left a treasury surplus of 200,000 pounds of gold, an astronomical sum that would provide his successors with substantial resources. This fiscal discipline reflected his austere personal habits. Unlike many predecessors, he spent relatively little on court luxury or monumental construction, preferring to build martial strength and financial reserves. This lengthy reign marked the apex of Eastern Mediterranean influence. Geographically, the realm stretched from southern Italy to the Caucasus, from the Danube to Syria. Its fighting units were professional, disciplined, and strategically deployed. Commercially, its currency dominated Mediterranean trade, while its merchants maintained networks stretching to Scandinavia, Central Asia, and beyond. Culturally, its artistic and intellectual achievements commanded universal respect. In contrast to the fragmented political landscape of Western Europe and the internally troubled Abbasid Caliphate, the Eastern Mediterranean world stood as a model of centralized authority and administrative efficiency. Yet beneath this impressive facade lay structural vulnerabilities that would become increasingly apparent after the Great Lord's death. The theme system, once the backbone of defensive strategy, had gradually eroded. Professional mercenary forces increasingly replaced the farmer-soldier militia of earlier centuries. This trend improved combat effectiveness in the short term, but severed the link between land ownership and martial service that had provided sustainable defense. Moreover, the system grew increasingly expensive, creating potential fiscal strain despite the substantial treasury reserves. Similarly, despite efforts to protect small landholders, the concentration of property among aristocratic families continued. Provincial magnates accumulated vast estates, reducing both the tax base and the pool of independent farmers available for recruitment. These powerful families also pursued quasi-independent policies in frontier regions, sometimes negotiating with foreign powers contrary to Constantinopolitan interests. Such centrifugal tendencies remained controlled under firm guidance, but would emerge as significant threats under less capable stewardship. Additionally, commercial concessions granted to Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice, established problematic precedents. In exchange for naval assistance against threats in the Adriatic, Greek authorities granted Venetian merchants preferential trading rights in Constantinople and other commercial centers. These privileges seemed minor in the context of immediate strategic needs, but would eventually undermine native commerce and create dangerous economic dependencies. The achievements of this period must also be considered in light of the failure to establish continuity. The decision to remain unmarried and childless meant the throne passed to a brother, Constantine VIII, an indolent figure who had spent his 6 decades in luxurious obscurity while the great statesman governed. This succession choice reflected a persistent weakness in the Eastern political structure. The absence of clear, hereditary principles often led to succession crises that undermined institutional stability. When the masterful strategist died in December 1025, contemporaries could scarcely have anticipated how quickly the fruits of his long reign would dissipate. The impressive geographical expanse, martial supremacy, and fiscal abundance he bequeathed to his successors masked structural weaknesses that would soon manifest. His death marked not only the passing of an exceptional figure, but the beginning of a period of declining fortunes for the civilization he had brought to its medieval pinnacle. The decades following the passing of the Bulgar Slayer witnessed a dramatically swift reversal of Eastern Mediterranean fortunes. Constantine VIII, who inherited the throne at age 65, had spent his life pursuing pleasure rather than governance. During his brief 3-year reign, this indolent figure initiated a troubling pattern of elevating court favorites over experienced administrators. More consequentially, his death without male heirs in 1028 sparked a succession crisis that would destabilize the court for decades. The throne passed to his daughter Zoe, who at age 50 married the official Romanos Argyros, who ruled as Romanos III. Thus began a confused period, when authority passed through a series of Zoe's husbands and adoptive sons. After Romanos died, under suspicious circumstances in 1034, Zoe married her young lover Michael, who ascended as Michael IV. Upon his death in 1041, she adopted his nephew, who briefly ruled as Michael V, before being overthrown and blinded in a popular uprising. Zoe then ruled jointly with her sister Theodora, before marrying for a 3rd time to Constantine Monomachos, who became Constantine IX. This soap opera of court intrigue might seem merely colorful, but it had profound consequences. Governing continuity dissolved amid changing factions and personnel. Civil service positions became rewards for political loyalty rather than administrative competence. Command assignments similarly suffered as they were granted to court favorites with minimal battlefield experience. The solid governance structures that had been maintained for decades crumbled as aristocratic factions maneuvered for advantage in each successive regime. These domestic troubles coincided with emerging external threats. Along the eastern frontier, Seljuk Turkic peoples began migrating into Greek territories. Unlike previous nomadic groups that had occasionally raided frontier regions, these newcomers sought permanent settlement. Initially appearing as scattered bands, they gradually coalesced under unified leadership with strategic objectives. By mid-century, they had established a formidable presence in Armenia and eastern Anatolia. Meanwhile, in southern Italy, adventurers from Normandy who had initially arrived as mercenaries began carving out independent principalities from Greek possessions. Led by the remarkable Hauteville family, these warriors combined martial prowess with political acumen. Robert Guiscard and his brother Raja systematically conquered holdings in Apulia and Calabria, establishing a dominion that would eventually encompass Sicily as well. Greek authorities, distracted by internal struggles and focused on Eastern concerns, failed to respond effectively to this Western challenge. The northern frontier also grew increasingly unstable. Pecheneg nomads crossed the Danube to raid Thracian provinces. Restive Bulgarian populations, conquered just a generation earlier, showed signs of discontent. Serbian principalities asserted greater autonomy. The elaborate security system, constructed through martial strength and diplomatic acumen, unraveled on multiple fronts simultaneously. Perhaps most consequentially, the fiscal discipline that had characterized governance for decades collapsed under subsequent regimes. The enormous treasury surplus rapidly diminished through a combination of reduced tax collection, increased expenditures, lavish court spending, and outright corruption. Constantine IX, Monomachos, initiated a fateful debasement of the numisma, reducing its gold content. This monetary manipulation temporarily eased fiscal pressures, but undermined confidence in the currency that had served as the Mediterranean standard of value for centuries. The social foundation of Eastern Mediterranean martial strength also eroded during this period. The theme system, already weakened, further deteriorated as aristocratic landowners consolidated their holdings at the expense of independent farmers. Laws protecting smallholders from foreclosure were increasingly ignored. The stratiotica catamarta, lands tied to service obligations, diminished as properties were sold, subdivided, or absorbed into great estates. The traditional connection between land tenure and defense obligation, which had sustained Eastern armies for centuries, weakened significantly. Partly in response to diminishing theme forces, reforms under Constantine IX created greater reliance on hired foreign contingents. The Tagmarta were reorganized with outside units, including Varangian Norse warriors, Armenian infantry, and Turkish cavalry. While these professional soldiers provided immediate effectiveness, their loyalty depended on regular payment rather than inherent devotion to the Eastern Mediterranean civilization. This arrangement functioned adequately when treasury resources remained abundant, but created vulnerability in times of fiscal strain. The culmination of these troubling trends came in 1071, a year of catastrophic defeats on two fronts. In April, Norman forces under Robert Guiscard captured Bari, the last Greek stronghold in Italy, ending 5 centuries of presence on the peninsula. Far more consequentially, in August at Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, Seljuk forces under Sultan Alp Arslan routed the Eastern Army, led by Romanos IV of Diogenes, who was himself captured on the battlefield. The disaster at Manzikert derived partly from court intrigue. Romanos, who had ascended the throne in 1068 by marrying the elderly Empress Regent Eudokia Makrembolitisa, faced opposition from the powerful Ducas family. When he marched eastward with a substantial force to confront the Seljuk threat, key commanders affiliated with the Ducas faction abandoned him during the battle, contributing to the collapse. After his capture, further court machinations prevented the payment of his ransom and led to his brutal blinding upon return to Constantinople. While Manzikert was not immediately apocalyptic in territorial terms, the peace treaty with Alp Arslan involved tribute payment rather than massive land concessions. Its aftermath proved catastrophically consequential. The overthrow and mutilation of Romanos IV triggered a destructive civil war lasting nearly a decade. Competing claimants to the throne sought Seljuk support, inviting Turkish forces into Anatolia as mercenaries and allies. Turkish migration accelerated in this chaotic environment, with nomadic groups occupying depopulated rural areas, while Greek authorities remained focused on internal power struggles. By 1081, when a brilliant general seized control and established a new governing household, the heartland in Anatolia had been largely lost. Seljuk Turks established the Sultanate of Rum centered at Nicaea, less than 100 miles from Constantinople. Greek populations fled westward toward the coast, or sought protection in fortified urban centers. Agricultural lands that had provided food supplies and tax revenue for centuries fell under Turkish control. The territorial core of Eastern Mediterranean civilization, since the 7th century, had effectively collapsed within a single decade. This Anatolian catastrophe brought multi-layered consequences. Strategically, the loss of productive agricultural lands diminished the resource base upon which Eastern power had rested. Recruitment areas that had provided fighting men for the themes were no longer available. Commercially, trade routes to Central Asia became less secure. Psychologically, the seemingly sudden collapse of territories held for centuries profoundly shocked the Eastern society, challenging assumptions about divine protection and prestige. Further compounding Eastern Mediterranean misfortunes, this period witnessed significant ecclesiastical division. In 1054, long-simmering tensions between the patriarchates of Constantinople and Rome erupted in mutual excommunications. Though initially considered a temporary diplomatic breach, rather than a permanent schism, the Great Schism, as it would later be known, marked the formal separation of Orthodox and Catholic traditions. This religious division complicated potential alliances with Western powers at precisely the moment when Greek authorities faced unprecedented threats. The rapid dissolution of Eastern Mediterranean influence after 1025 highlights how the impressive edifice constructed during previous decades depended on capable stewardship maintaining effective governance structures. Internal weaknesses, aristocratic power grabs, court intrigue, fiscal mismanagement, and martial reorganization manifested when strong central authority wavered. External pressures from Seljuks, Normans, and Pechenegs exploited these vulnerabilities. The resultant contraction of lands and resources happened with breathtaking speed, transforming a Mediterranean superpower into a fragile state within half a century. As the 11th century concluded, the Eastern Mediterranean civilization faced an existential crisis more severe than any since the initial Muslim conquests 4 centuries earlier. Anatolia, the heartland since the 7th century, had largely fallen to Turkish control. Italian territories, maintained as a Western outpost for 5 centuries, were fully lost. The Balkan regions secured through the earlier campaigns grew increasingly restive. The legendary wealth that had sustained diplomacy and martial power had diminished through mismanagement and debasement. The themes system that had provided sustainable defense for generations had collapsed. Hope emerged in the form of a new governing household, established when a brilliant general seized power in 1081. This gifted statesman would initiate significant restoration efforts, but the path forward required innovative approaches, including outreach to potential Western allies, that would introduce an entirely new dynamic to Eastern Mediterranean affairs. Amid cascading calamities, a figure of remarkable adaptability and resilience emerged from the aristocratic martial community. Born to a distinguished family, this talented commander seized power in 1081, with backing from the army and nobility. The situation he confronted appeared nearly hopeless. Seljuk Turks occupied most of Anatolia. Norman forces under Robert Guiscard threatened the Balkan coastline. Treasury resources had dwindled through mismanagement and currency debasement. Administrative structures had deteriorated through decades of factionalism. The new regime responded with pragmatic reforms that recognized changed circumstances rather than attempting to restore outdated systems. Militarily, efforts to reconstitute the old theme organization were abandoned, acknowledging the permanent loss of Anatolian territories where this system had flourished. Instead, The pronoia system was developed, granting land revenues to aristocratic families in exchange for providing equipped mounted warriors. This arrangement formalized the aristocratic martial leadership that had already emerged de facto, channeling noble ambitions into service to the throne. Fiscal reform proved equally innovative. Facing a depleted treasury and debased currency, new gold and electrum coins were created to replace the adulterated numisma. More controversially, church property was confiscated and ecclesiastical objects melted to address immediate financial needs. These emergency measures provoked criticism, but provided essential resources for defense against Norman and Turkish threats. Long-term, tax collection was reorganized and court expenditures curtailed, gradually restoring fiscal stability. Administrative restructuring concentrated authority in hands of the extended ruling family. Brothers, cousins, and in-laws received key commands and governmental positions. While critics viewed this as nepotism, it created a leadership core bound by kinship ties and loyalty to the dynasty. After decades of destructive court factionalism, this approach provided needed stability, albeit at the cost of limiting meritocratic advancement for non-relatives. Diplomatically, the new regime displayed remarkable adaptability. The Pecheneg threat was neutralized by allying with another nomadic group, the Cumans, playing potential adversaries against each other. Arrangements with Venetian merchants granted trading privileges in exchange for naval support against Norman aggression. Most consequentially, outreach to Western Christendom sought military assistance against Turkish encroachment in Anatolia. This Western outreach involved a calculated risk. In 1195, envoys were sent to Pope Urban II, requesting hired forces to help reclaim Anatolian territories. The Greek court envisioned modest, controllable assistance under its command. What resulted instead was the First Western Expedition, a massive movement of Western warriors motivated by religious zeal rather than mercenary calculation. When these forces began arriving in Constantinople during 1096 to 1097, the Eastern Mediterranean authorities confronted an unprecedented challenge: how to harness this powerful but unpredictable ally without endangering their own position. The initial cooperation between Eastern authorities and Western leadership proved reasonably successful. Oaths were extracted from the Western princes to return former Eastern territories they might conquer. Guides, supplies, and some military support were provided, while wisely avoiding direct command of the Western forces. When the newcomers captured Nicaea in 1097, they honored their commitment and transferred the city to Eastern control. This key acquisition, just across the Bosporus from Constantinople, eliminated the most threatening Turkish position and secured vital communication routes. As Western armies pushed eastward into Anatolia and Syria, achieving victories at Dorylaeum and Antioch, Eastern forces moved to reclaim coastal territories in Western Asia Minor. By the early 12th century, many important cities and agricultural regions had returned to Eastern administration. Though the Anatolian heartland remained under Turkish control, the catastrophic losses of the post-Manzikert decade had been partially reversed. The Eastern Mediterranean recovery had achieved significant, if limited, geographical restoration. The ability to navigate the complex Western intervention reflected the practical leadership style of this period. While Eastern elites viewed the Western warriors with suspicion, noting their theological differences, political naivete, and sometimes brutal methods, working relationships with their leaders were maintained. When the Western expedition culminated in the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 and the establishment of Latin states in Syria and Palestine, The Eastern court accepted the reality that these territories would not return to their control, despite theoretical claims. Instead, focus remained on consolidating gains in Western Anatolia, while maintaining diplomatic influence over the newly established Latin principalities. The restoration continued under the second monarch of this new household, who ruled from 1118 to 1143. This capable figure, nicknamed the Beautiful for his moral character rather than physical appearance, built upon earlier foundations with less flamboyant but steady effectiveness. Systematic campaigns against Turkish positions in Anatolia reclaimed additional territories in Phrygia and Bithynia. Greek authority was reasserted in Cilicia and northern Syria, compelling the Latin Principality of Antioch to acknowledge Eastern overlordship. Throughout this period, administrative efficiency improved, fiscal strength increased, and martial discipline maintained high standards. The third ruler of this household, who succeeded in 1143, represented both the pinnacle and the limitations of Eastern Mediterranean restoration. Educated, energetic, and ambitious, he pursued an expansive foreign policy. His Western orientation manifested in personal appearance. He adopted Western-style clothing and participated in tournaments and in strategic priorities. Under his leadership, Eastern diplomacy wove complex alliances with Western powers against perceived Norman threats, culminating in a massive but unsuccessful campaign against Norman Sicily. His interests extended beyond traditional spheres. He intervened in Hungarian affairs, established influence over Latin states, and sought accommodation with the rising power of Venice. His cosmopolitan court welcomed Western visitors, including future Jerusalem King Amalric and various European diplomatic missions. This openness reflected both personal inclination and recognition of changing Mediterranean power dynamics as Western nations grew increasingly wealthy and militarily formidable. The achievement of this restoration period rested on pragmatic adaptation rather than nostalgic recovery. Rather than attempting to recreate theme armies, new military structures were developed based on pronoia grants and mercenary forces. Rather than reasserting ancient territorial claims, focus remained on defensible frontiers and strategic positions. Rather than maintaining traditional isolation from Latin Christendom, pragmatic engagement with Western powers prevailed. This flexibility enabled significant recovery from the earlier collapse, restoring Eastern Mediterranean influence as a respected, if diminished, power. Yet beneath this impressive reconstruction lay continuing vulnerabilities. The concentration of power within a single household, while solving immediate leadership problems, created potential succession difficulties. The pronoia system, though militarily effective, accelerated the concentration of wealth among aristocratic families. Commercial privileges granted to Italian maritime republics undercut native Greek merchants. Expanded diplomatic engagement with Western powers introduced complex dynamics that could potentially backfire. These structural issues remained manageable under capable leadership but created significant risks for the future. Moreover, the material basis of Eastern power had permanently diminished. Despite territorial recoveries in Western Anatolia, the agricultural heartland remained under Turkish control. Tax revenues never regained previous levels. Fighting forces, though effective, was smaller and more expensive than in earlier centuries. The commercial dominance that had sustained Eastern prosperity faced increasing competition from Italian city-states. Even at its restored height under the third monarch of this household, the Eastern Mediterranean dominion represented a significantly reduced entity compared to its condition a century earlier. The limitations of this restoration became painfully apparent after 1180. The heir to the throne, ascending at age 11, fell under the regency of his mother, Maria of Antioch, whose Western origins generated resentment. In 1182, a cousin seized power and initiated bloody purges of perceived opponents, particularly Latin residents of Constantinople. This internal turmoil coincided with growing external threats, including a resurgent Norman kingdom targeting eastern territories and aggressive Venetian commercial penetration. When the usurper was overthrown, the Restoration household ended amid scenes of horrific violence. The subsequent governing line proved disastrously incompetent, squandering the achievements of the Restoration within 2 decades. By 1203, Eastern governance had deteriorated so severely that commercial rivals and Western powers viewed the once formidable state as ripe for conquest. The stage was set for the most shocking reversal in Eastern Mediterranean history: the Fourth Western Expedition and the Latin conquest of Constantinople. The Eastern Mediterranean Restoration thus represents both an impressive achievement and a temporary reprieve. Through energetic leadership and pragmatic adaptation, the decline had been arrested and significant power rebuilt. Yet the fundamental structural challenges, diminished territorial extent, aristocratic power concentration, Italian commercial competition, and complex relationships with Western Christendom, remained unresolved. The breathing space created through these restoration efforts would prove insufficient for developing sustainable solutions to these challenges before disaster struck from an unexpected direction. The dawn of the 13th century found the Eastern Mediterranean realm in a precarious position, despite its outward appearance of continued prestige. Under the woefully inept Angeloi household, governance had deteriorated to dangerous levels. The gold coinage, for centuries, a standard of value throughout the Mediterranean, underwent repeated debasement. Provincial administration grew increasingly chaotic, as noble families pursued independent agendas with minimal central oversight. Fighting units, underpaid and poorly equipped, lost cohesion and effectiveness. Corruption pervaded the administrative apparatus, while the treasury dwindled through extravagance and mismanagement. Most consequentially, foreign policy blunders accumulated. Commercial privileges granted to Italian merchant communities, particularly those from the lagoon city, Pisa, and Genoa, had created virtual economic colonies within the Bosphorus capital itself. These foreign enclaves operated under their own laws, paid minimal customs duties, and increasingly dominated trade networks once controlled by native merchants. The resentment this arrangement generated among the local population periodically erupted into violence, most notably during a massacre of foreign residents in 1182. These bloody events were neither forgotten nor forgiven by powers across the Adriatic. Into this volatile situation stepped a young claimant to the throne, Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed and blinded Isaac II. Fleeing the Queen of Cities in 1201, this ambitious prince sought assistance from Western princes to reclaim his father's position, promising extravagant rewards in return: 200,000 silver marks, military aid for the planned expedition to Jerusalem, and, most controversially, submission of the Eastern faith to papal authority. These extraordinary pledges would have been difficult for a firmly established regime to fulfill. For a contested claimant with questionable legitimacy, they would prove impossible. Alexios found receptive ears among the leadership of the nascent Fourth Expedition, particularly with Boniface of Montferrat, its nominal commander, and Enrico Dandolo, the elderly but shrewd head of the commercial republic on the Adriatic. This venture, originally intended for Egypt, had already encountered severe difficulties. Financial shortfalls left the assembled foreign warriors unable to pay the arranged sum for transport. Dandolo ever the calculating merchant statesman, recognized an opportunity in the young prince's predicament. The expedition was diverted first to Zara, a Christian city that Venice wished to recapture, and then toward the Bosphorus metropolis itself. In June 1203, a formidable western flotilla appeared before the ancient walls. The elderly, blind Dandolo had transformed a potential financial disaster for his maritime republic into an opportunity to neutralize his most significant commercial rival. Isaac II and his son were restored to the throne after the ruling monarch, Alexios III, fled the city. The reinstated pair now faced the impossible task of fulfilling the extravagant promises made to their Western benefactors. Predictably, they failed. Anti-foreign sentiment within the populace soared as the new regime raised taxes and confiscated sacred valuables, attempting to satisfy Western demands. By January 1204, the situation had deteriorated completely. A popular uprising elevated a new figure, Alexios the Fine Ducas, nicknamed Mortzuflos for his prominent eyebrows, who promptly had the young Alexios IV strangled. This turn of events provided the Western leadership with a convenient justification for what many had likely contemplated from the beginning: tear up the restraining influence of papal prohibitions against attacking fellow Christians. The rank and file were told that the city, having murdered its legitimate sovereign, now represented a home of murderers and usurpers. The assault began in April 1204. The Bosphorus capital had withstood numerous sieges throughout its illustrious history, protected by its formidable walls and strategic position. Against the Alvars and Persians in 626, against Arab forces in 674 to 678, and again in 717 to 718, against Bulgarian attackers on multiple occasions, the Queen of Cities had stood inviolate for nearly 9 centuries. Now, facing Western knights with naval support from the Lagoon Republic, its defenses finally failed. On April 12, 1204, after several days of fighting, the walls were breached. What followed ranks among history's most tragic episodes of urban destruction. For 3 days, the splendid metropolis endured unrestricted plunder at the hands of foreign fighters. Holy buildings were desecrated, monastic institutions pillaged, and palaces stripped bare. The magnificent cathedral witnessed scenes of shocking sacrilege: drunken revelers seated upon the patriarch's throne, prostitutes performing lewd dances in the sanctuary, sacred vessels used for drinking alcohol. Priceless artworks were destroyed or melted down for their precious metal content. Ancient bronze statues from the classical era, preserved for centuries, were consigned to the furnace. The celebrated bronze horses from the Hippodrome were shipped to the Adriatic, where they still adorn St. Mark's Basilica today. Beyond mere plunder lay cultural catastrophe. The Bosphorus metropolis had served as civilization's greatest repository of ancient learning. Its collections contained countless manuscripts dating to classical antiquity, works of philosophy, science, history, and literature that had survived the centuries while being lost in Western Europe. Many of these irreplaceable works were destroyed during the chaos. Others were scattered or damaged beyond recovery. While not a complete cultural extinction, many texts had already been copied and distributed to other centers, and some collections escaped the worst destruction. The sack, nevertheless, represented an incalculable loss to humanity's cultural heritage. Sacred artifacts received particularly focused attention from the Western plunderers. The Queen of Cities had accumulated Christendom's greatest collection of devotional treasures: fragments of the True Cross, apostolic remains, items associated with the Virgin Mary, and countless holy objects. These sacred elements were systematically looted and transported westward. So extensive was this devotional plunder that scarcely a cathedral or significant holy house in Western Europe failed to acquire some artifact from the eastern metropolis. The Lagoon Republic, Paris, Halberstadt, and countless other Western centers still display treasures carried off during those fateful days. The human toll proved equally devastating. While casualty figures remain uncertain, thousands of inhabitants perished during the assault and subsequent chaos. Countless women, from aristocrats to commoners, suffered sexual violence. Families that had resided in the city for generations found themselves suddenly homeless. The population, estimated at nearly 400,000 before the sack, plummeted dramatically. Many nobles, scholars, artisans, and clerics fled the horrors, seeking refuge in still independent eastern territories or other Mediterranean havens. Following the violent capture came systematic occupation. The conquerors established what historians term the Latin occupation, installing Baldwin of Flanders as its first ruler. This new political entity represented just one component of a broader partition plan. Phoenician merchants claimed strategic coastal locations and islands throughout the Aegean, establishing their commercial dominance over eastern Mediterranean shipping lanes. Various Western nobles received lands as fiefs, creating the Principality of Achaia in the Peloponnese, the Duchy of Athens in central Greece, and numerous smaller lordships throughout former eastern territories. The conquered metropolis itself underwent profound transformation. Merchants from the lagoon secured control of 3/8 of the city, including crucial harbor facilities. Western ecclesiastical authorities displaced native clerics. The magnificent cathedral, for 9 centuries, the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity, became a house of worship under a foreign bishop. Traditional devotional practices were suppressed in favor of Western rites. The administrative apparatus was replaced by foreign feudal relationships unfamiliar to local inhabitants. This dramatic reversal elicited varied responses from contemporary observers. Western perspectives often portrayed the conquest as divine judgment against Eastern separatists who had broken from Rome's authority. A typical view described the events as appropriate retribution for perceived treachery and doctrinal error. The Pope, while initially expressing shock at the extent of sacrilegious behavior, eventually accepted the situation as potentially advancing church unity under Roman primacy. For Eastern Mediterranean society, the trauma could scarcely be overstated. Beyond the immediate physical destruction and human suffering lay a profound spiritual crisis. How could divine providence have permitted foreigners to desecrate the holiest location in their world? The event shattered assumptions about heavenly protection that had undergirded Eastern identity for centuries. Chroniclers described the catastrophe in apocalyptic terms, seeing it as punishment for collective sins, requiring deep spiritual reflection and repentance. More pragmatically, the occupation necessitated political reorganization among the nobility and remaining administrative structures. While the Bosphorus metropolis had fallen, significant territories remained outside foreign control. 3 principal successor centers emerged, each claiming legitimate continuation of the ancient Mediterranean legacy. In Western Asia, Minor, a new administration coalesced around Theodore Lascaris, son-in-law of the former ruler Alexios III. In Epirus, along the Adriatic coast, Michelangelos, a cousin of the deposed dynasty, established an independent domain. In distant Trebizond, on the Black Sea's southern shore, Alexios and David Komnenos, grandsons of a previous sovereign, created a third focus of Eastern governance. Each of these successes maintained elements of traditional, administrative, and cultural continuity. court ceremonial, despite reduced circumstances, preserved ancient protocols. Traditional devotional practices continued uninterrupted outside areas under foreign control. Educational traditions endured, with scholars and manuscripts finding refuge in these alternative centers. The mechanisms of tax collection, diplomatic correspondence, and provincial administration adapted to reduced circumstances while maintaining institutional memory. Among these successor centers, the one in Asia Minor quickly emerged preeminent. Its proximity to the foreign capital, control of fertile agricultural lands, and able leadership under the Lascaris household provided advantages over its rivals. Theodore Lascaris, crowned in 1208, established the ecclesiastical legitimacy of his domain by installing a patriarch in his capital after the chief hierarch fled foreign occupation. This spiritual continuity proved crucial for maintaining claims to legitimate succession. Theodore's fighting capabilities likewise impressed contemporaries, as he successfully defended his lands against both Western forces and pressure from Turkish nayas. Nevertheless, the situation after 1204 represented an unprecedented nadir in the Eastern Mediterranean's fortunes. The ancient metropolis, for 9 centuries, a gleaming center of Eastern Christianity, repository of classical learning, and symbol of unbroken connection to antiquity, lay in partial ruins under foreign occupation. Territorial cohesion had shattered into competing successor administrations and Western fiefdoms. Commercial networks formerly benefiting local merchants now served primarily Italian interests. The cultural treasures, accumulated over nearly a millennium, had been scattered, destroyed, or appropriated. This catastrophe surpassed even the dire circumstances following Manzikert, representing what many contemporaries considered an apocalyptic judgment. Yet amid this darkness, seeds of eventual renewal had already been planted in exile. The nobility, clerics, and learned classes, dispersed among successor centers, maintained a fierce determination to reclaim their heritage. The dream of returning to the Queen of Cities never died. Far from extinguishing the flame of Eastern Mediterranean civilization, the catastrophe of 1204 forced its custodians to adapt, reform, and prepare for the possibility of reclaiming their stolen legacy. The establishment of rival centers after the Bosphorus capital's fall created a complex political landscape. While each successor claimed legitimate continuation of the ancient heritage, the domain in Asia Minor quickly demonstrated advantages over its competitors. Theodore Lascaris, crowned in exile with makeshift regalia, proved an effective crisis leader. His administration possessed significant agricultural wealth, controlled key trade routes, and maintained geographic proximity to the occupied metropolis. Perhaps most importantly, Theodore secured devotional legitimacy by hosting the chief hierarch, who had fled foreign occupation. This exile administration faced immediate challenges on multiple fronts. To the east, pressure from Turkish neighbors remained constant, requiring vigilant frontier defense. To the west, foreign forces from the occupied capital posed an existential threat, necessitating careful diplomatic and military countermeasures. Internal politics required balancing aristocratic ambitions while rebuilding administrative structures. Theodore navigated these complex challenges with remarkable skill, gradually consolidating his position as the primary Eastern Mediterranean power, despite reduced circumstances. Theodore's successor, his son-in-law, John III, Vatatzes, who guided the realm from 1222 to 1254, further strengthened these exile foundations. A capable administrator with strategic vision, John expanded territorial control in both Asia Minor and the Balkans. He reformed agricultural production, famously writing that he had used his wife's jewelry to finance cattle purchases for peasant farmers, a policy that increased both food security and tax revenue. Under his guidance, the exile court developed increasingly effective diplomatic relations with major powers, including the neighboring Sultanate, the Bulgarian Tsardom, and even the Holy Roman Authority, whose sovereign Frederick II became John's ally against the occupiers of the Queen of Cities. The rival center in Epirus initially showed considerable promise under the energetic leadership of Theodore Komnenos Doukas. By 1224, Epirate forces had recaptured Thessalonica from foreign control, establishing a competing imperial claim that temporarily eclipsed the prestige of the Asian exile court. This momentum proved short-lived, however. In 1230, Theodore suffered catastrophic defeat and capture at the hands of Bulgarian forces at the Battle of Klokotnitsa. Though Epirus continued as an independent principality, its imperial ambitions effectively ended, leaving the Asian administration as the undisputed focus of restoration hopes. The third successor Ascenta, Trebizond, pursued a different trajectory. Nestled on the Black Sea's southeastern coast, this remote outpost of Eastern civilization maintained independence through geographic isolation and commercial significance. Controlling trade routes connecting the Black Sea to Persia and the Caucasus, Trebizond developed a distinctive multilingual, multicultural character. Its prosperity derived primarily from customs duties and trade facilitation, rather than agricultural production. Though maintaining imperial pretensions and traditional devotional identity, Trebizond increasingly operated as a specialized commercial principality, rather than a serious contender for the ancient legacy. Amid these political developments, Eastern Mediterranean cultural life adapted to exile conditions. The court in Asia Minor deliberately positioned itself as guardian of tradition and classical heritage. Scholars found patronage and protection, establishing educational institutions that preserved ancient learning. The administrative library collected manuscripts from throughout the fragmented territories, minimizing further cultural losses. John Vatatzes founded an imperial school that trained future civil servants and maintained educational standards despite reduced circumstances. This cultural continuity proved crucial for preserving institutional memory and bureaucratic expertise, essential for eventual revival. Devotional life, similarly, flourished in exile. The chief hierarch, relocated to the Asian court, continued ordaining clerics, addressing theological questions, and maintaining communication with distant communities. Monastic establishments, those great repositories of spiritual and intellectual traditions, remained active throughout the fragmented domains. This spiritual organization served as a unifying institution, providing continuity amid political fragmentation and reinforcing collective memory of a shared heritage temporarily disrupted but not destroyed. Economic adaptation proved equally important. Cut off from the Bosphorus capital's commercial networks, successor administrations developed alternative arrangements. The Asian court negotiated trade agreements with Italian city-states, particularly Genoa, which sought advantages against Phoenician dominance. Agricultural production received renewed emphasis, reducing dependence on imported foodstuffs. Local industries developed to replace goods formerly sourced from the fallen metropolis. These economic adjustments helped fund military capacity while maintaining living standards despite reduced circumstances. Meanwhile, conditions within foreign-occupied territories gradually deteriorated. The feudal structures imposed by Western conquerors proved ill-suited to Eastern Mediterranean social and economic realities. Foreign nobles typically viewed their possessions as opportunities for resource extraction, rather than societies requiring thoughtful governance. Cultural and devotional differences created persistent tensions with local populations. Most critically, the occupation administration faced chronic financial difficulties and military manpower shortages, relying increasingly on mercenaries it struggled to pay. The foreign occupation weathered a major crisis in 1261, when a general from the Asian court, Alexios Strategopoulos, conducting reconnaissance near the Bosphorus capital, discovered the city largely undefended. With most occupation forces engaged in a naval expedition, Strategopoulos seized the opportunity, entering through an unguarded gate with assistance from local inhabitants. The foreign ruler, Baldwin II, fled without offering resistance, ending the Western regime after nearly 6 decades. This dramatic recapture represented the culmination of patient strategy under a new leader who had recently seized power in the exile court. Originally appointed as regent for the young John IV Lascaris, this ambitious figure had himself crowned co-emperor, before orchestrating the child's blinding and imprisonment. A ruthless action that secured his authority but generated lasting controversy. Despite these morally questionable beginnings, the reclamation of the Queen of Cities marked a triumphant moment in recovery from the catastrophe of 1204. The metropolis he entered bore little resemblance to the magnificent urban center that had fallen to Western forces. Decades of foreign misgovernance had accelerated urban decline. The population had plummeted from pre-sack estimates of 400,000 to perhaps 35,000. Entire neighborhoods stood abandoned. Many landmark buildings remained damaged or repurposed. The great cathedral, though structurally intact, had been stripped of countless treasures. The hippodrome lay partly ruined. The traditional palace complex had deteriorated to the point that the returning sovereign chose to establish his court in the Blakeney Palace in the city's northwestern section. The contrast between the capital's former glory and its diminished state proved stark. Beyond physical deterioration lay profound economic challenges. Italian merchants dominated commercial networks, formerly controlled by native traders. Maritime republics retained possession of key islands and ports throughout the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes had been permanently reconfigured to benefit Western interests. The Bosphorus metropolis, once the unrivaled commercial hub, where goods from Asia, Europe, and Africa converged, now represented merely one port among many in an economic system centered on Italian city-states. Territorial realities presented similar limitations. The restored administration controlled merely a fraction of lands governed by its predecessors. The Peloponnese remained largely under Western principalities. Much of the mainland was governed by foreign dukes and counts. Numerous Aegean islands had become colonial possessions. In Asia Minor, Turkish advances had permanently reduced territorial depth. Even within nominally restored areas, central authority remained weak, with provincial aristocrats exercising nearly autonomous control over their localities. The new sovereign thus faced the monumental task of rebuilding a functioning administration from these diminished foundations. His restoration efforts proceeded along multiple fronts. Urban renewal in the ancient metropolis received immediate attention, with resources directed toward repairing essential infrastructure and devotional buildings. Population growth was encouraged through tax incentives and resettlement programs for Eastern Mediterranean peoples from other regions. Diplomatic initiatives sought to neutralize external threats while playing rival powers against each other, a necessity given limited military capacity. Financial constraints shaped all aspects of restoration policy. Unlike earlier periods when substantial gold reserves supported ambitious initiatives, the returning administration operated under severe fiscal limitations. Tax revenues from the reduced territorial base proved insufficient for ambitious military or construction projects. Creative financing became necessary, including debased coinage, forced loans from wealthy subjects, and commercial concessions to Italian cities in exchange for immediate payments. The most consequential of these financial arrangements involved the Genoese, who received extensive commercial privileges in exchange for naval support against Phoenician interests. The Galata district, across the Golden Horn from the Bosphorus capital, became a virtually autonomous Genoese colony, with its own walls, administration, and legal system. While this arrangement provided short-term benefits, including crucial naval assistance, it further entrenched foreign economic domination within the Eastern Mediterranean sphere. Devotional policy presented equally complex challenges. Sacred institutions had maintained spiritual and organizational continuity during the foreign occupation, serving as a unifying force among dispersed communities. Upon reclaiming the Queen of Cities, the returning sovereign immediately restored traditional worship in the great cathedral and reinstalled the chief hierarch in his traditional seat. This ecclesiastical restoration symbolized cultural and spiritual continuity with the pre-1204 heritage, reinforcing legitimacy claims of the returning administration. Yet external pressures severely complicated devotional affairs. Western powers, particularly the papacy, continued viewing the Eastern faith community as separatist. Periodic talks regarding unification had occurred during the exile period, but without lasting resolution. The new regime, facing military threats from Western powers claiming to advance their own doctrinal interests against schismatics, pursued devotional union as a diplomatic strategy to neutralize these justifications for aggression against his vulnerable domains. These unification efforts culminated in the Council of Lyon in 1274, where representatives from the restored court accepted papal supremacy and Western theological positions. This controversial agreement, while temporarily advancing diplomatic objectives, provoked furious opposition within Eastern Mediterranean society. Monastics, lower clerics, and ordinary believers viewed these concessions as betrayal of sacred tradition. The union remained largely theoretical, never implemented in practice despite official acceptance. This spiritual controversy further strained the fragile restored administration, dividing society when unity was desperately needed. Despite these formidable challenges, the returning sovereign succeeded in re-establishing legitimate rule in the ancient capital and consolidating a functioning state from exile's fragments. His achievement, viewed in context of the seemingly insurmountable obstacles faced, represents a remarkable testament to determination and strategic flexibility. The Queen of Cities, he reclaimed, would never regain its former magnificence or territorial extent, yet it preserved essential continuity with the ancient Mediterranean heritage that might otherwise have been permanently lost. The period between 1204 and 1261 thus emerges as both catastrophic nada and remarkable demonstration of cultural resilience. The Eastern Mediterranean civilization, despite suffering its most devastating reversal, maintained core institutional, intellectual, and spiritual continuities while adapting to radically altered circumstances. When opportunity for restoration arrived, sufficient foundations remained to rebuild at least a shadow of former glory. This tenacity in preserving civilizational essence amid extreme adversity stands as perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Eastern Mediterranean historical experience. The recapture of the Queen of Cities in 1261 marked a moment of triumph for the inheritors of ancient tradition. Yet this victory belied profound weaknesses that would characterize their final centuries. The restored administration controlled merely a fraction of territories, once governed by its predecessors. Portions of Thrace, Macedonia, and Western Asia Minor, scattered Aegean islands, and parts of Greece. Meanwhile, rivals encircled this diminished domain: Serbian and Bulgarian principalities in the Balkans, Anatolian beyliks across the straits, and Italian commercial interests throughout the Mediterranean. The return to the storied metropolis posed significant challenges for the ruling Palaiologos household. Restoration of monuments, walls, and infrastructure demanded resources this shrunken society could ill afford. Demographic revival proved difficult. The population remained a shadow of its former size despite incentives for resettlement. Most consequentially, economic opportunities had permanently shifted. Italian maritime powers, especially Venice and Genoa, now dominated the sea lanes and commercial networks once controlled by native merchants. Foreign enclaves within and near the urban center enjoyed extensive privileges, including tax exemptions and legal autonomy, further undermining local commerce. Martial weakness compounded these difficulties. The fighting force, once the Mediterranean's most sophisticated military apparatus, had declined into a collection of mercenary units and limited provincial levies. Naval power had virtually disappeared. Vessels were borrowed or rented from Italian towns. This impotence left the realm unable to resist aggressive neighbors or protect distant provinces. Gradually, remaining territories in Asia Minor fell to Turkic advances, while Serbian expansion claimed Balkan possessions. By the early 14th century, the domain had contracted to little more than the area surrounding the Bosphorus. Portions of Thrace and scattered holdings in Greece. Fiscal deterioration paralleled territorial decline. Tax revenues from the reduced lands proved insufficient for maintaining even basic governmental functions. Successive rulers debased the currency, once the Mediterranean's gold standard, reducing its precious metal content to negligible levels. Commercial privileges granted to Italian merchants diverted customs duties, traditionally a major revenue source, into foreign hands. Desperate for funds, court officials sold offices, confiscated properties, and imposed emergency levies that further alienated the merchant and landowning classes. This financial collapse created a vicious cycle. Inadequate revenues prevented maintenance of effective defense forces, which led to territorial losses, which further reduced the tax base. Despite these material constraints, the Paleologan period witnessed remarkable cultural achievements. Scholars, theologians, and artists produced works of lasting significance, preserving classical and spiritual traditions even as political fortunes waned. This intellectual activity, known as the Paleologan Renaissance, encompassed manuscript preservation, theological discourse, artistic innovation, and philosophical inquiry. Monasteries maintained ancient texts, while court patronage supported educational institutions. Architecture and iconography reached new heights of sophistication, with masterpieces like the Shora Church, Carrier, showcasing exquisite mosaics and frescoes. These cultural accomplishments provided a sense of continuity amid political contraction, maintaining identity as heir to classical antiquity and sacred tradition. Internal political fragmentation further weakened the diminished society. The Paleologan succession system proved chronically unstable, generating repeated civil conflicts. The first such crisis erupted between 1321 and 1328, when Andronikos II faced rebellion from his grandson, Andronikos III. This dynastic struggle depleted the treasury, damaged provincial administration, and allowed neighboring powers to seize additional territories. Worse followed in the 1340s, when John VI Cantacuzene, regent for the young John V Palaiologos, claimed leadership himself, triggering a devastating 6-year civil war that permanently crippled defensive capabilities. This internal strife coincided with 2 additional catastrophes. In 1347, the Black Death reached the ancient center, killing perhaps a third of its already diminished population. This demographic collapse further reduced economic productivity, tax revenues, and recruitment pools. Simultaneously, a new and more formidable competitor emerged across the straits in Anatolia, a fresh dynastic initiative that would eventually eclipse all other Turkic principalities to become the dominant force in the region. Founded around 1300 by Osman, a minor frontier chieftain, this nascent administration initially represented just one among many Anatolian entities competing for territory in the peninsula's political dissolution. Several factors distinguished their approach: effective martial organization that combined cavalry tactics with infantry forces, pragmatic governance that incorporated existing administrative structures, and accommodating policies toward local populations. Under Osman's son, Orhan, 1326 to 1362, these approaches yielded significant expansion at the expense of both neighboring principalities and remaining Bosphorian possessions in Asia Minor. The crossing into Europe marked a critical turning point. Taking advantage of the 1340s civil war, Orhan's forces established a presence in Gallipoli in 1354. This foothold expanded rapidly under his successor, Murad the Faon, 1362 to 1389, who captured Adrianople, renaming it Edirne, and established it as his European headquarters. From this base, expansion radiated outward, capturing Thrace, Macedonia, and portions of Bulgaria and Serbia. By the 1370s, the ancient metropolis found itself increasingly surrounded, with the advancing polity encircling it on both European and Asian shores. Faced with this existential threat, the court pursued diplomatic solutions through a combination of appeasement, alliance building, and appeals to Latin Europe. Successive lords acknowledged suzerainty, paid tribute, and even participated in campaigns as vassals. Marriage alliances were arranged with Italian and Western powers in hopes of securing assistance. Appeals to Rome emphasized the threat to Christendom, seeking armed expeditions against advancing forces. These desperate measures yielded limited results. Occasional Western ventures, like that of Amadeus of Savoy in 1366, provided temporary relief but no lasting solution. A moment of hope emerged in 1402 when Tamerlane, the Central Asian conqueror, defeated and captured Sultan Bayezid the Firm at the Battle of Ankara. This unexpected reversal triggered a succession crisis that temporarily halted expansion. For approximately 2 decades, the Bosphorian court enjoyed respite from immediate pressure as Bayezid's sons fought for control of their father's fragmented domains. Manuel II skillfully exploited this situation, recovering some territories and reasserting authority over previously lost regions, including Thessalonica. This reprieve proved short-lived. By the 1420s, Murad II had consolidated power and resumed expansionist policies. Thessalonica, briefly restored to Bosphorian control, fell to invading forces in 1430, despite being transferred to Venetian protection. The last significant territories, beyond the immediate vicinity of the ancient metropolis, the despotate of the Morea in southern Greece, governed by members of the Palaiologos household, faced increasing pressure despite temporarily improved fortifications and administration. A final attempt at securing Western assistance led to the Council of Florence in 1439, where a delegation led by John VIII and Patriarch Joseph II negotiated ecclesiastical union with Rome. This controversial agreement while achieving formal reconciliation between Eastern and Western traditions, generated fierce opposition within the metropolis and throughout remaining territories. The famous statement attributed to the court official Lucas Notaras, "Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat," captured widespread sentiment among both populace and clergy that Catholic domination represented a threat to sacred tradition potentially worse than conquest from the East. When the young Mehmed ascended to leadership in 1451 at age 19, the fate of the thousand-year society hung in the balance. This ambitious youth, educated in both Islamic and Western traditions, harbored dreams of conquest that centered on claiming the Bosphorus jewel to establish his place in history. His predecessors had largely tolerated the continued existence of the ancient center as a tributary state, focusing their expansionist energies elsewhere. The young leader, however, recognized that true legitimacy as heir to Roman, Bosphorian, and Islamic imperial traditions required possession of the site that had been called New Rome. Preparations for the final conflict began immediately upon his accession. A massive fortress, Rumeli Hisara, was constructed on the European shore of the Bosphorus, complementing an earlier fortification on the Asian side. Together, these installations controlled maritime traffic through the strait, allowing forces to isolate the metropolis from potential naval relief. Military units were assembled from throughout the expanding dominion. Most significantly, Mehmed commissioned enormous siege cannons from the Hungarian engineer Urban, who had initially offered his services to the Bosphorian court, but been rejected due to financial constraints. These massive weapons, capable of hurling stone projectiles weighing over 600 pounds, would prove decisive in the coming confrontation. As preparations accelerated, the final Palaiologos leader, Constantine XI, worked desperately to strengthen his position. The protective perimeter, though still formidable, had deteriorated through neglect and previous conflicts. Limited financial resources were directed toward repair of the most vulnerable sections. Appeals went out to Western powers for assistance, producing minimal response. A Genoese contingent under Giovanni Giustiniani Longo and a small papal detachment represented the extent of foreign aid. The promised religious union with Rome was finally proclaimed in the magnificent cathedral in December 1452, further alienating substantial portions of the population who opposed compromise with Western traditions. The disparity in resources could hardly have been more stark. The besieging forces, numbering perhaps 80,000 fighters and supplemented by a substantial fleet, faced a garrison of approximately 7,000 defenders. The Bosphorian naval presence had dwindled to a handful of vessels, mostly Italian. The population, still not recovered from the Black Death and subsequent outbreaks, provided limited manpower for defense. Yet despite these overwhelming disadvantages, the ancient barricade, constructed under Theodosius II a millennium earlier, still offered formidable protection that had withstood countless previous assaults. As winter yielded to spring in 1453, the final confrontation between emerging power and ancient legacy began. On April 6th, besieging units completed their encirclement of the historic metropolis, establishing positions along the entire western perimeter, from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara. The young leader established his command pavilion opposite the Lycus Valley, where the protective barrier appeared most vulnerable. The massive siege cannons were positioned to target this section, commencing a bombardment unprecedented in medieval warfare. Within the threatened enclave, Constantine organized the defense with limited resources available. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, received responsibility for the critical western section facing the main concentration. Venetian and other foreign contingents defended the maritime edges along the Golden Horn. The minuscule naval force deployed a defensive chain across the Golden Horn's entrance, preventing hostile vessels from accessing the sheltered harbor that flanked the northern sections of the land barrier. The initial assaults tested the defenders' resolve without committing full forces. Meanwhile, the colossal cannons pounded the ancient fortifications daily, causing significant damage that defenders struggled to repair overnight. Traditional siege engines, scaling ladders, and mining operations supplemented the artillery bombardment. Despite inflicting substantial casualties on the attackers, the defenders faced the grim mathematics of attrition. Each passing day reduced their limited numbers, while losses among the besiegers could be readily replaced from their vast manpower reserves. A pivotal moment came on April 22nd, when an Italian relief flotilla fought its way through the naval blockade to reach the beleaguered site. This small victory boosted defender morale temporarily, but highlighted naval vulnerability among the besiegers. The young commander, recognizing this weakness, implemented an audacious solution. His engineers constructed a wooden trackway overland from the Bosporus to bypass the defensive chain across the Golden Horn. Using this improvised route, approximately 70 vessels were transported on rollers and relaunched into the Golden Horn, outflanking the defensive barriers and threatening the previously secure northern districts. This naval maneuver forced the defenders to reallocate their limited manpower to protect additional sections of the perimeter, further thinning their already stretched positions. Attempts to destroy the vessels in the Golden Horn failed, with a Venetian naval attack suffering significant losses. The strategic situation deteriorated daily as artillery continued reducing the ancient fortifications to rubble in key sections, while defenders exhausted supplies of weapons and ammunition. After nearly 8 weeks of siege, Mehmed prepared for the final assault. Chronicles record that he offered the defenders an opportunity to surrender, with guarantees of lives and property, which Constantine refused. Whether this exchange actually occurred remains uncertain, but both leaders understood the historical significance of the impending confrontation. For Constantine, surrender remained unthinkable. He would defend the 1,000-year legacy to its final moment. For the young conqueror, capturing the coveted prize would establish his historical reputation when numerous predecessors had failed. The decisive attack commenced after midnight on May 29th. Following a day of rest and devotional preparation in the besiegers' camp, the assault followed a deliberate sequence. First came irregular troops to exhaust defender ammunition and energy, followed by Anatolian provincial forces, with the elite Janissary Corps held in reserve for the decisive moment. Initial waves suffered heavy casualties, but achieved their purpose of depleting defender resources and stamina. Near dawn, the contingent of Janissaries discovered a small postern gate, the Kirka Porta, accidentally left unlocked, allowing them to enter between the inner and outer barriers. Simultaneously, Justiniani, the Genoese commander, leading the defense of the most vulnerable section, suffered a serious wound and withdrew from the battlements. His departure created confusion and damaged morale among nearby defenders. The attackers concentrated on this weakened section, with elite units finally breaching near the Blashané Palace. As fighters poured through multiple gaps in the defenses, organized resistance collapsed. Constantine XI, refusing opportunities to escape, died fighting alongside his remaining troops, his body never identified amid the chaos. By midday, the ancient metropolis had fallen to its besiegers. Initial looting followed military tradition, allowing victorious troops 3 days of plunder. though the duration was curtailed to just one day. The human toll proved catastrophic for remaining inhabitants. Thousands perished during the final assault and subsequent chaos. Many more were enslaved, with survivors gathered for sorting and distribution, according to value. Noble families faced particular targeting for ransom potential, while skilled artisans were identified for forced relocation. Sacred buildings suffered desecration, with the magnificent cathedral witnessing scenes reminiscent of 1204, though now performed by different intruders. Late on May 29th, the young conqueror himself entered the captured prize, proceeding directly to the cathedral. There, he ordered an immediate halt to looting and proclaimed the structure converted to an Islamic house of worship. An imam ascended the pulpit to proclaim the Islamic declaration of faith, marking the symbolic transformation of Christendom's greatest sanctuary into a mosque. This calculated act established Mehmed as both conqueror and preserver, claiming the legacy while transforming its fundamental character. Unlike the occupation after 1204, the new master intended permanent incorporation of the site into his expanding domains. Indeed, he envisioned it as his own capital, recognizing its strategic position and historical significance. Rather than wholesale destruction, his approach balanced symbolic transformation with practical preservation. While some sanctuaries became mosques and new architectural elements were introduced, much of the ancient urban fabric remained intact. Significant population transfers brought Muslim, Jewish, and Christian residents from throughout the expanding realm to repopulate the devastated location. For Eastern Mediterranean civilization, this moment marked a definitive endpoint. Unlike previous catastrophes, the 7th century Arab conquests, the 11th century Seljuk advance, or the 13th century Latin occupation, no viable successor emerged to maintain traditions of governance and cultural continuity. The despotate of the Morea briefly survived in southern Greece until 1460, when it too fell to the expanding power. Trebizond, the remote Black Sea outpost, endured until 1461, before similarly succumbing to Mehmed's ambitions. With these final acquisitions, the last independent fragments of the thousand-year civilization disappeared. The human and cultural diaspora following these events proved consequential, far beyond the immediate tragedy. Scholars, artists, and manuscript collections flowed westward, particularly to Italian centers like Venice, Florence, and Rome. This intellectual migration contributed significantly to Renaissance developments, bringing classical texts and their learned interpreters directly into Western European cultural circles. Prominent intellectuals like Cardinal Bessarion, formerly a leading Eastern scholar, became influential agents of cultural transmission, creating libraries and educational institutions that preserved ancient learning for future generations. Military experts and administrative officials from the Forlan Society similarly found positions throughout Mediterranean courts, bringing their specialized knowledge to new contexts. Naval architects, diplomatic experts, and fortification engineers applied centuries of accumulated expertise in Western services. The conquerors likewise absorbed administrative techniques, diplomatic protocols, and architectural influences, incorporating these elements into evolving governance structures. The spiritual legacy found various continuations. The Patriarchate, after brief disruption, received recognition under Gennadios Scholarios, establishing administrative structures for governing faith communities within the expanding domains. This accommodation, known as the Millet system, granted religious and cultural autonomy under ultimate foreign sovereignty. Meanwhile, traditions continued in Russian territories, where Moscow increasingly positioned itself as the Third Rome. legitimate heir to the fallen center's spiritual authority. Monastic communities, particularly those on Mount Athos, maintained liturgical and intellectual traditions, despite changed political circumstances. For Western European observers, these events generated complex responses. Initial shock and expressions of Christian solidarity quickly gave way to pragmatic accommodation with the new regional reality. Venetian and Genoese representatives established commercial agreements with the new administration within months of the conquest. Rome continued rhetorical calls for crusading response, while practical diplomatic engagement proceeded simultaneously. Within decades, the emerging power had become an accepted, if feared, participant in Mediterranean geopolitics. The significance of 1453 extends beyond merely ending a particular political entity. This momentous year marked a threshold between medieval and early modern historical periods. The fall eliminated the last significant vestige of the ancient Roman imperial structure that had shaped Mediterranean civilization for nearly 2 millennia. Simultaneously, it announced the rising dominion as a major European power, rather than merely an Asian or Middle Eastern entity. Technological factors proved equally transitional. The decisive role of massive artillery in breaching the ancient defenses symbolized warfare's evolution beyond medieval methods. Most poignantly, this catastrophic conclusion represented the final act of classical Mediterranean continuity. Despite adopting Christianity, speaking Greek rather than Latin, and evolving distinctive administrative approaches, the fallen society had maintained fundamental continuity with ancient Roman imperial structures for 1,123 years, since Constantine's dedication of his new capital in 330. This remarkable institutional longevity, unmatched in European history, preserved elements of classical civilization through the medieval period that would otherwise have perished. The ultimate fall, when it finally came, severed living connection to antiquity, while simultaneously transmitting its legacy into new contexts where it would shape emerging modern civilizations. The epic narrative had reached its conclusion, but its cultural, intellectual, spiritual, and political influences remained embedded throughout European, Middle Eastern, and Russian civilizational development. As the smoke cleared from the conqueror's cannons in the early summer of 1453, one historical chapter had closed definitively. Yet the legacy of this remarkable civilization continued shaping world history through channels and influences that remain visible into our contemporary era. As the final echoes of battle faded from the fallen Queen of Cities in that fateful spring of 1453, so ended a civilization that had endured for more than a millennium. Yet while political structures crumbled beneath Mehmed's cannons, the influence of this remarkable society continued to radiate outward, shaping the development of numerous cultures and traditions across multiple continents. This enduring legacy manifested through various channels, each preserving different aspects of the fallen realm's contributions to human civilization. Perhaps most immediately apparent was the diaspora of learned individuals who fled westward. Scholars carrying precious manuscripts found welcome in Italian centers of learning, where their knowledge of classical Greek texts proved invaluable to Renaissance humanists. Figures like Cardinal Bessarion, once a leading Eastern intellectual before converting to Catholicism, established important collections that preserved ancient wisdom that might otherwise have vanished. The legendary Platonic Academy in Florence benefited enormously from this intellectual migration, as did numerous Italian courts and universities. This transfer of classical knowledge helped fuel the intellectual revolution that would ultimately transform European thought. Artistic techniques and aesthetic sensibilities likewise traveled westward. The distinctive style of manuscript illumination, mosaic decoration, and icon painting influenced Italian artists during crucial formative periods of Renaissance development. El Greco, born Domenikos Theotokopoulos, on Venetian-controlled Crete, represents perhaps the most famous example of how Eastern artistic traditions merged with Western techniques to create innovative visual expressions. Less celebrated, but equally significant, were numerous artisans who brought specialized crafting methods to Western workshops, enriching European decorative traditions. The legal heritage proved similarly influential, though in less direct ways. Justinian's comprehensive legal compilations had already shaped medieval European jurisprudence through earlier transmission. The continued preservation and study of Roman law principles provided intellectual foundations for developing nation-states as they constructed more sophisticated governance systems. Concepts of sovereign authority, administrative hierarchy, and systematic codification found new applications in emerging European powers, often transmitted through administrative structures in Italy that had maintained contact with Eastern traditions. Architectural influence manifested most visibly in religious buildings. The distinctive central dome construction, pioneered in Hagia Sophia, inspired countless structures throughout Orthodox lands and beyond. Russian church architecture adapted these approaches, creating the distinctive onion domes that would become synonymous with Moscow's skyline. In the West, Renaissance architects studied Eastern methods of dome construction, with Brunelleschi's magnificent cupola for Florence's cathedral, representing a triumph of engineering that drew on Eastern precedents while innovating beyond them. Even Sinan, the brilliant Ottoman architect, incorporated Byzantine elements into his Islamic designs, creating magnificent structures that synthesized multiple traditions. Military and defensive technologies represented another significant legacy. The elaborate defensive systems that had protected the Bosphorus capital for centuries provided models for fortification throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Engineers trained in Eastern traditions found employment designing defenses for Venice, Rhodes, and numerous other strategic locations. Naval architectural techniques, shipbuilding methods, and maritime administration similarly influenced developing European powers as they expanded their maritime reach. Even the famous Greek fire found echoes in experimental incendiary weapons developed by European military engineers. Commercial networks, established during centuries of Eastern Mediterranean predominance, continued functioning under new management. Trade routes connecting Europe with Asia, perfected through centuries of Byzantine mercantile activity, remained active pathways of exchange despite political transformations. Commercial techniques, contractual forms, and financial instruments developed in Eastern marketplaces found new applications in Italian banking houses. The gold standard, established by Constantine and maintained, albeit with gradual debasement, until the final centuries, provided a model for monetary stability that later European systems would strive to emulate. Perhaps most profoundly, spiritual and religious traditions continued developing along paths established during the thousand-year evolution of Eastern Christianity. The Orthodox Church, though politically decapitated by the fall, maintained its distinctive theological approaches, liturgical practices, and monastic traditions. Under Ottoman governance, the Patriarchate continued functioning through the millet system, which granted religious communities substantial autonomy in managing internal affairs. Beyond former Eastern territories, Russian Orthodoxy flourished as Moscow positioned itself as the Third Rome, claiming to preserve authentic tradition after the fall of both Old and New Rome. This religious continuity carried forward not just theological concepts, but an entire approach to spirituality, emphasizing mystical experience, liturgical beauty, and iconic representation, rather than the scholastic rationalism increasingly dominant in Western Christianity. Monasticism in particular maintained ancient spiritual practices on Mount Athos and other centers that remained active despite political changes. These traditions preserved approaches to contemplative life that would later influence various spiritual revivals in both Eastern and Western contexts. Diplomatically, the sophisticated methods developed through centuries of Eastern statecraft influenced emerging international relations systems. The careful balance of firmness and flexibility, ceremonial formality and practical accommodation that had characterized Byzantine dealings with neighboring powers provided models for early modern diplomatic development. Ceremonial protocols, documentary forms, and negotiating techniques found new applications in diplomatic chancelleries across Europe. Even the concept of diplomatic immunity and formal embassy establishments drew on Eastern precedents. For the Ottomans' successors, who claimed the physical space of the fallen realm, Byzantine administrative practices provided ready-made governance solutions for managing diverse populations across extensive territories. The new masters retained many Eastern administrative structures, record-keeping methods, and taxation systems, simply adapting them to new priorities, rather than replacing functioning bureaucratic machinery. This pragmatic adoption of predecessor institutions characterized Ottoman governance throughout its early expansion, allowing rapid incorporation of conquered territories into effective administrative frameworks. In broader historical perspective, the significance of this vanished civilization lies particularly in its role as preserver and transmitter of ancient knowledge through the medieval period. While Western Europe experienced dramatic transformation following Rome's 5th century collapse, the Eastern continuation maintained institutional, intellectual, and cultural continuity with the classical world. Without this preservation of Roman legal concepts, Greek philosophical texts, architectural techniques, administrative structures, and artistic traditions, much of classical civilization might have perished entirely, rather than remaining available for rediscovery during the Renaissance. The Forlan's society also represents a remarkable case study in cultural adaptation and synthesis. Beginning as the Eastern administrative division of the Roman state, this civilization evolved distinctive characteristics by blending Roman governance, Greek language and culture, and Christian religious practice into a unique composite tradition. This synthesis proved remarkably resilient, persisting through dramatic changes in territorial extent, ethnic composition, and external challenges. The ability to maintain core identity while adapting to changed circumstances offers insights into how civilizations navigate existential challenges, lessons with continuing relevance in our contemporary world. Perhaps most poignantly, the ultimate fall in 1453 demonstrates both the fragility and durability of human cultural achievements. Political structures that had endured for more than a millennium could indeed collapse beneath sufficient pressure. Yet the cultural, intellectual, spiritual, and artistic legacy created during that millennium continued shaping human civilization, long after the political framework had disappeared. The physical structures lay in ruins or repurposed to new functions, but the ideas, methods, and values that animated Eastern Mediterranean civilization found new expressions in diverse contexts. As the morning sun illuminates the magnificent dome of Hagia Sophia, now bearing minarets added by its later occupants, we witness the physical embodiment of this complex legacy. The building itself, still standing nearly 1,500 years after Justinian's architects conceived it, has served as Christian cathedral, Muslim mosque, secular museum, and mosque again. Its very stones embody the layered history of a region where civilizations have succeeded one another, while each absorbing elements from its predecessors. The golden light filtering through ancient windows falls on spaces where emperors were crowned, patriarchs celebrated sacred liturgies, sultans prayed toward Mecca, and millions of visitors from around the world have stood in awe of human creative achievement. This enduring monument reminds us that while political entities may rise and fall, the highest achievements of human civilization, be they architectural masterpieces, philosophical insights, spiritual wisdom, artistic expressions, or legal principles, transcend the specific contexts of their creation. The remarkable society that flourished for 11 centuries between Constantine's dedication in 330 and Mehmed's conquest in 1453 has physically vanished, yet its essence endures in countless aspects of our modern world. From religious practices to legal concepts, from architectural principles to diplomatic protocols, from artistic techniques to administrative structures, the legacy of this vanished realm continues shaping human civilization in ways both obvious and subtle. In this sense, the fall of 1453 represents not an ending, but a transformation, the final metamorphosis of a civilization that had continuously evolved throughout its long existence. The political structure disappeared, but the cultural DNA lived on, recombining with other traditions to shape new expressions of human creativity and organization. The last defenders who fell along the ancient walls in that distant spring could scarcely have imagined how their civilization would continue influencing human development for centuries after their heroic last stand. This continuity of influence across apparent historical ruptures reminds us that human civilization represents an ongoing conversation across generations and cultures, a dialogue in which voices from the past continue informing present understandings and future possibilities. The brilliant light of Eastern Mediterranean civilization, though politically extinguished in 1453, continues illuminating our world today through countless reflections of its original radiance. In libraries and legal codes, in churches and mosques, in art and architecture, in diplomatic protocols and administrative structures, the legacy endures, a testament to the remarkable society that preserved classical heritage through the medieval millennium, while creating distinctive contributions to human civilization. As we conclude our journey through this extraordinary historical epic, from Constantine's new foundation to Mehmed's final conquest, we recognize that the story never truly ended. It merely transformed as the cultural treasures of this vanished realm found new custodians and expressions in diverse societies across Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. In this sense, we ourselves participate in the continuing legacy of this remarkable civilization, whose greatest achievements transcended its political boundaries, both in space and time. Though the Queen of Cities fell, the light of its cultural brilliance continues shining through the centuries, illuminating our understanding of human possibilities in both achievement and resilience.